Chapter 1170. After the Upper Yuan dynasty, there was no festive atmosphere in the capital. Everything remained the same. Many things happened at the beginning of the year, such as the birth of the crown prince, the establishment of diplomatic relations between Jing and Wu, and the resistance against Qi Zhao. This should be the most eventful beginning of the year for the Jing kingdom in recent years. The cold of spring had not passed, and the sky had just brightened. There were already many vendors who had woken up early on the streets of the capital. The vendor who sold breakfast exhaled and rubbed his hands vigorously. He said, "The business is still good during the new year. One day is equivalent to half a month's business. It would be great if the new year was celebrated every day." The butcher who was 10 feet away mocked him. "Then why do you have a stall? Go home and hug your wife while dreaming. Every day is the new year. Give me 2 steamed buns and a bowl of porridge." A man who had woken up early for work turned his head to look at the butcher and said, "Don't forget to leave 2 caddies of lean meat stuffing for me today. I'll make dumplings at home tonight." The butcher waved his hand and said, "I didn't forget to make dumplings on the 1st and 15th day of the new year. This strange rule of yours hasn't changed in the past few years." The man smiled and said, "We were poor a few years ago. Now we have to eat back all the money we owe." The butcher said while cutting the meat, "Then you should eat meat every day." The man took a bite of the bun and said vaguely, "If the people in the capital ate meat every day, the happiest person would be you, Butcher Jing. It was really hard to do business in the past few years. There were wars every day, and the people didn't have much money left. We couldn't even sell the steamed buns." The vendor who sold breakfast added. The man drank a mouthful of porridge and said coldly, "It's all because of that mother of King Qi kingdom. Why can't they know their place? In the past, they teamed up with the Zhao kingdom to fight us, and now they're fighting the Zhao kingdom. They even beat their own people." Butcher Jing chopped the meat and said, "It's all thanks to His Highness Jiang of Silla's heavenly punishment. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'd still be bullied." Sigh, "I heard that His Highness returned to the capital a few days ago. I wonder if he'll leave this time. With His Highness not in the capital, there hasn't been a big event in the capital for years. Let's go." The man finished his breakfast and left behind a few copper coins. He wiped his mouth and said, 2 days ago, when I passed by the gate of the Jiang of Silla's manor, the main gate of the manor was already closed. His Highness has probably already left Jingdou. There are still so many playboys in the capital." Jing Tufu sighed and murmured, "Why did His Highness leave?" In Hibiscus Garden, Li Xian held his son in his arms and swayed left and right. He also sighed and said, "They leave just like that every time." 3 small figures ran over from afar. In the front was a little girl about 5 or 6 years old. She hugged his arm and said, "Father, father, I want to learn martial arts." Li Xian nodded and said, "Learn, learn. As long as your mother agrees, Imperial Father will also agree." "Mother has agreed." The little girl smiled and said, "I'll go find Aunt Mingzu." After saying this, she seemed to remember something and murmured, "Aunt Mingzu is no longer in Jingdou, then I'll go find little aunt." "Oh, little aunt eloped with the prince consort." Li Xian looked at her in surprise and said, "Eloped? Who taught you that?" The little girl rolled her eyes and said, Little aunt said that when you leave with someone you like, it's called eloping." After saying this, she didn't wait for Li Xian to ask any questions and quickly ran away. Li Xian shook his head and stopped thinking about this matter. He lowered his head to look at the sleeping child and whispered, Zave, you have to grow up quickly." In another part of Hibiscus Garden, 2 young girls walked hand in hand on the grass, chatting about something with smiles on their faces. Li Han held the kite string and followed behind the 2 of them. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up. However, when he thought of something, the corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up and turn into a bitter smile. In the military academy, a group of young people wearing thin clothes were swimming in the mud. Old General Shui stood at the side, holding a long whip in his hand and waving it from time to time. He then passed the whip to old General Ma beside him. In a restaurant in Jingdo, Tsing Shichen, Lu Dayo, and Lu Yi sat by the window. In another corner of the restaurant, a white-haired middle-aged man was drinking by himself. Beside him, a tall and sturdy man was making the woman singing in the restaurant giggle. In a shop not far from the restaurant, a fat man with bruises on his face pointed at a few workers and said unhappily, "In the future, treat the customers like they are your wives and coax them." How do you coax your wives at home? How do you coax customers here? In a royal cemetery outside the city, a bearded young man waved a hoe and painstakingly cleared the weeds around a lone grave, in the Zhao Kingdom. 3 days ago, the imperial city of the Zhao Kingdom had been besieged by the army of the Qi Kingdom. 10 miles away from the imperial city, tents were erected one after another. Although it was night time, the tents were still brightly lit. Soldiers patrolled the area from time to time. The commander's tent in the center of the tents was completely dark. Coughing sounds could be heard from a small, inconspicuous tent. In front of Zhao Yi was a map. A city was drawn on the map. He had already circled a few of the city gates in red. A general looked at him and said worriedly, "Your Majesty, Lord Yang has sent news that reinforcements from the Jing Kingdom will arrive in half a month." Zhao Yi opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His coughing became even more intense. Someone looked at him and couldn't help but say, "Your Majesty, it's getting late. You'd better get some rest. We'll discuss this matter tomorrow." Zhao Yi covered his mouth and coughed for a while. Then, his breathing gradually calmed down. He clenched his fist and waved his hand. In a slightly hoarse voice, he said, "Pass down my order. Tomorrow, we attack the city." "Yes, Your Majesty." Several generals in the tent shouted and half knelt on the ground at the same time. After everyone had left the tent, Zhao Yi unclenched his fist and stared blankly at the trace of blood on his palm. In the Wu Kingdom, it was late at night. In an even more serene hall in the depths of the imperial palace, the crown that symbolized the emperor had been worn for a long time was a little heavy. Yang Liuqing was still not used to it. She took it off and put it aside. Then, she opened another booklet. She flipped through it and saw that it was the same content as before. Then, she threw it aside. If those people still don't know what's good for them, I'll teach them a lesson myself. An old voice came from a corner of the hall. Yang Liuqing shook her head and said, "In fact, what they said is not unreasonable." The old man looked surprised. "You?" Yang Liuqing stood up and walked into the hall. Then, she said, "In any case, I'll still pass the throne in the future. The next emperor of the Wu Kingdom must also have the bloodline of the Yang family." The old man was gloomy for a moment and asked, "Among those people they proposed, is there anyone you like?" Yang Liuqing shook her head. The old man lowered his head and seemed to be thinking about something. A figure appeared in his mind with a slightly angry expression. "Bastard, you were so active at that time. Where have you gone now? This dress is very nice." A voice suddenly rang out in the hall. Yang Wanli's hair stood on end. He suddenly looked in a certain direction. The next moment, he breathed a sigh of relief. Then, the expression on his face became even more shocked. You've broken through." Yang Liuqing's face lit up. She hurried over and said, "Master." Chapter 1171. It took him more than half a month to return to Shuzhou from the capital city. Mainly in consideration of the two old ladies' health, Li Yi deliberately slowed down. He would rather take a long detour than take the dangerous mountain path. It was just after the Lantern Festival when he left. When he arrived in Shuzhou, it was almost April. Rui, Li Mu, and Li Jin accompanied the two old ladies. Shaning would not leave this time. Yongning was naturally happy. Li Duan was also very happy because Shanning spoiled him the most. His closeness to Shanning must have been established since she took care of him when he was a child. Whether it was the capital city or other places, Li Yi always felt very depressed. As for Shu Prefecture and Rui City, they stood among the rolling mountains. Looking into the distance, they felt that every breath of air they breathed was free. He began to understand Li Xian a little. In addition to being more shameless than him, Li Xian also longed for freedom more than him. In April, the mountains were already covered with lush greenery. Li Yi stood at the peak and looked down. Amidst the lush greenery of the mountain, there were light-colored ribbons that stretched far into the distance. It was a wide cement road that connected all the mountains. It was also the most important mountain path in the fringe lands. "What are you thinking about, my husband?" A soft voice came from behind him. Li Yi turned around and saw Rui standing there. He had an illusion that Rui seemed to be standing there the whole time. Whether he was in Qing and Prefecture, the capital city, the Qi Kingdom, or the Wu Kingdom, it seemed that there was always a figure standing behind him. He could see her as soon as he turned around. Lying on the grass, Li put his hands behind his head and said, "I had a dream last night. I dreamed that one day when I woke up, I was in another place." Sitting beside him, Rui bent her legs and asked, "What kind of place was it?" Li thought for a moment and said, "A very large library, surrounded by bookshelves." The bookshelves were filled with books, books that could not be finished in a lifetime. "When I woke up, you, Rui, and Xiao Huan were not beside me. It was as if I was a person from another world, and everything here was just a dream." In fact, Li Yi often had such a dream. He often woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep anymore. Putting her hand on his head, Rui gently pressed it and said, "You must be too tired, my husband. I have been here the whole time." Li Yi held her hand and said, "What if I really came from another world?" Looking down at him, Rui said, "My husband came from another world. Actually, I have something that I have been hiding from you." She took a deep breath as if she had made a big decision. Looking at Li Yi, she said seriously, "Actually, I am a fairy from heaven. I accidentally fell into the mortal world and lost my mana." Li Yi was startled. After staring at her for a long time, he suddenly sat up and pushed her down on the grass. Smiling, he said, "Is that so? My wife is a fairy. Then I want to see how a fairy from heaven is different from a woman in the mortal world." Rui was a grandmaster. Li Yi couldn't beat her, but when he teased her, she was just a weak woman. This was different from Rui. After a while, her breathing became a little rapid. She moved away from Li Yi's hand and said hurriedly, "My husband, don't make trouble." Li Yi rested his head on her lap and said, "Fortunately, I didn't run away the night Rui took me up the mountain. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to marry such a fairy wife." Rui looked at him and said in surprise, "You wanted to run away at that time?" "Of course I do." Li nodded and said, "I didn't know you were such a fairy at that time. What if you were a man with a face full of fat and weighed 200 pounds? I might as well die." Rui combed her slightly messy hair and asked with interest, "Then why didn't you run away later? Were you subdued by my beauty? Do you want to hear the truth or a lie?" Rui thought for a while and said, "Lie first." "Lie." Li Yi looked at her and said, "Of course, I found out that you were such a peerless beauty. I was subdued by your beauty. When you opened the door and came in, I even thought of the names Dwainer and Xiaomu." "That's a lie." Rui looked at him with a smile. She moved her hand away from his head and put it on his waist. She asked, "What's the truth?" Feeling the movement on his waist, Li Yi smiled and said, "What truth?" "What I said just now was the truth. It couldn't be more true." He immediately felt a pain on his waist. Rui looked at him and said, "If you don't say it, you can sleep with Sister Emingzu or Sister Wanru tonight." "Of course not." Emingzu and Wanru hadn't entered the room yet. they definitely wouldn't let him enter the room. Although Rui usually didn't fight for anything, Ruoqing and Zuemo would definitely listen to her, not to mention Xiao Huan. Li Yi thought for a while and said, "Actually, I wanted to wait for you to come in, knock you out, and then run, but then you smashed the solid wooden table with a single slap." Li Yi was still a little scared when he thought about it. "If I ran at that time, would you hit me?" "Yes." Rui nodded without hesitation and said, "Would still do it now." There was no good result from telling the truth. Every once in a while, Li Yi would be able to come up with a famous saying. Women only wanted to listen to good things, regardless of whether they were true or not. This was like how they could say they weren't beautiful, that their faces were thick, and that their buttocks were round, but men definitely couldn't go along with what they said. Otherwise, they would be courting death. Lies would always be rewarded with erotic rewards. If he told the truth, he would be beaten. Rui had been violent for so many years, and she began to learn Rui's gentleness. Rui had been gentle for so many years, and she began to learn Rui's violence. Li Yi felt that he might have discovered a theorem. Between sisters, the theorem of gentleness never changes, or the theorem of violence never changes. Gentleness wouldn't disappear out of thin air, nor would it appear out of thin air. It could only be transferred from one sister to another, and the total amount would always remain the same. The same was true of violence. How to find the balance between them was a problem that he needed to study in depth in the next few years, decades, or even decades. He was also puzzled by another question. Why was it that when Rui was violent, not only did he not hate it, but he would feel a kind of pleasure in his heart? This might be a kind of self-comfort, out of a human sense of self-protection. After all, there were already 3 grandmasters in his family, Rui, and Emingsu. In this life, no matter what, even if he became a grandmaster, he would not be able to make a comeback. If he couldn't change the reality, then he would change himself. If he couldn't resist, then he would enjoy it. As for why he liked this kind of Rui, it was because this kind of Rui was more real. This was not the awakening of his masochism, this was love. Li Yi rubbed his buttocks, and Rui used his arm as a pillow. Suddenly, she said, "Husband, let's go to find Rui." Shuzhou, Jiang of Sila's mansion. Li Duan skipped into a room, and soon ran out. He held a piece of paper in his hand, ran to third Miss Qin, who had just walked into the yard, and said in panic, "Grandma, bad news, father and mother eloped." Chapter 1172. In the room, Shanning rubbed Li Duan's head and said, "They didn't elope. They went to find Aunt." Li Duan was relieved and murmured, "I thought father and mother didn't want me and Xiao Mu and Xiao Jin anymore." Shanning comforted him and then bent down to look at him. She asked, "Now can you tell me who taught you to elope?" Li Duan was startled and ran outside, but Shanning grabbed his ear. Shanning pinched his face and said, "You're so young. You should learn to elope. Didn't Xiao Nyang elope with father? You even learned to talk back." "Is your butt itching again?" Li Duan covered his ears and his heart sank. Xiao Nyang changed. Xiao Nyang was no longer the Xiao Nyang who bought him candies. How did Xiao Nyang change? It seemed that he couldn't tell Xiao Nyang about eloping with Xiao Rui, but he could tell Xiao Mu. Xiao Mu was still young and didn't even know what eloping was. He didn't need to be afraid of others knowing, and he didn't need to keep it to himself. Shanning slapped Li Duan's but a few times and told him to study hard and practice martial arts. Then she went to another yard. Emingsu sat in the study and opened an envelope. Xu Ning walked in. Seeing that she was reading carefully, he stuck his head out to take a look. This letter was a spy from the imperial court. The Jing kingdom sent 30,000 soldiers and 100,000 soldiers from the Zhao kingdom to the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom as reinforcements. This time, the emperor of the Qi kingdom led 300,000 soldiers. Of course, this 100,000 soldiers were not enough. However, there were still more than 100,000 soldiers in the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom. With the help of Tian Fa, they didn't need to fear the Qi kingdom. This letter arrived today, which meant that they had been in the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom for at least a month. The next letter should be the news of victory. She sat down at the desk and said, "Royal sister, we're already here. Why are you still reading these things?" This time, the Jing kingdom supported Zhao against Qi, not because the Jing kingdom had nowhere to use its power, nor was it a whim of the imperial court. It was a decision made after much consideration. This involved a series of political and interest factors, and to a large extent, it would change the structure of the countries in the next few decades. However, Shou Ning would not understand these things. She put down the letter and asked, "Aren't you teaching Yongning martial arts? Why is she here again?" Xiaomu pestered her to go play on the slide. Xiaoning took the letter and looked at it. She shook her head and said, "When will Xiao Rui come? It's more lively when there are more people." May of the 5th year of Jinghe. It was the end of spring and the beginning of summer, one of the most pleasant months of the year. In May, not only did the warm wind of early summer sweep across the land, but there was also a thunderous news. In the lotus garden of the Jing kingdom, when Li Xian woke up from his afternoon nap, he found several old generals standing in front of the palace with solemn expressions. In the Wu kingdom, the imperial court meeting had just ended. The officials walked out of the main hall, their faces still filled with disbelief. A month ago, the capital of the Zhao kingdom, Qiang, was conquered by the Qi kingdom. The civil and military officials in the imperial city, including the king of the Zhao kingdom, were all captured. The reinforcements, including the 30,000 elites of the Jing kingdom, were all captured, except for those who died in battle. It was said that the Qi kingdom's soldiers suffered great losses because of the heavenly punishment of the Jing kingdom during the battle. However, not long after the two armies started fighting, the sunny weather suddenly became overcast with dark clouds. Sand and pebbles flew everywhere, followed by heavy rain. The heavenly punishment lost its power, and the army of the Qi kingdom turned the tide in a short period of time, winning the Battle of Qiang. Thus, the Zhao kingdom was destroyed. In the Jing kingdom, the morning court meeting, which had not been held for many days, had lasted for several hours today. The army of the Jing kingdom, which had been invincible, and had created many legends, had suffered a setback for the first time in these years. The soldiers and generals who were captured by the Qi kingdom were a problem that needed to be dealt with. The defeat of this battle was also very important. A civil official said with great regret, "This is an unfavorable time. If it weren't for the heavenly punishment, our army would have been defeated." *T. Old General Shui did not care that this was the court meeting. He pointed at his nose and scolded, "Is the Jing kingdom's army only relying on heavenly punishment?" Old General Ma was so angry that his beard was trembling. He pointed at his nose and shouted, "The Qi kingdom has 300,000 soldiers. That's an army of 300,000 soldiers, not 300,000 pigs." With heavenly punishment, the Jing kingdom had obtained countless victories in the past few years. This caused most people in the court to forget how powerful the Qi kingdom was in the past. The strength of the country and the strength of the army allowed them to crush and humiliate the Jing kingdom for decades. Although heavenly punishment had given the Jing kingdom a few years to turn around, the Qi kingdom was still the Qi kingdom. They had not become weaker. Without heavenly punishment, the Jing kingdom would not have much of an advantage against the Qi kingdom. Moreover, this time, they were fighting against the Qi kingdom's 300,000 soldiers with only 100,000 soldiers. This was a heavy blow to the Jing kingdom from the Qi kingdom. However, for the Jing kingdom, the significance of this incident was more than just a crushing defeat. The Minister of War, Yan Bing, stepped forward and bowed. "Your Majesty, for the safety of the captured soldiers, we need to send messengers to negotiate with the Qi kingdom as soon as possible." The capital governor, Lu Dao, pondered for a long time. Finally, He stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, the captured soldiers are important. But this time, the Zhao kingdom has brought a large amount of heavenly punishment. I'm afraid that it has fallen into the hands of the Qi kingdom. If they obtain the formula of heavenly punishment." Lu Dao did not finish his words, but the entire imperial court broke out in a cold sweat in fright. Heavenly punishment was the Jing kingdom's divine weapon. They all knew very well how powerful it was. If the formula of heavenly punishment fell into the hands of the Qi kingdom, they dared not imagine the consequences. They could not afford to bear it. This meant that in the future, every war with the Qi kingdom would be a war of heavenly punishment. There would be more casualties than any previous war. This meant that the Jing kingdom's military advantage, which they had painstakingly built up, would be gone. After the morning court session ended, it seemed that the entire sky above the capital city was shrouded in a layer of dark clouds. In a restaurant in a certain province of the Wu kingdom. The Qi kingdom. The Qi kingdom has annihilated the Zhao kingdom. The Zhao kingdom. The Zhao kingdom is gone just like that. That's right. Even the emperor has been captured. And the Jing kingdom's reinforcements have also become prisoners. Doesn't the Jing kingdom have heavenly punishment? How could they lose? It said that the Jing kingdom's army gained a lot of advantages by relying on heavenly punishment. However, when the emperor of the Qi kingdom personally led the army to stand on the city wall, the weather was sunny. Suddenly, a strong wind blew and heavy rain poured down. The heavenly punishment of the Jing kingdom became useless. I heard that the Qi kingdom's emperor invited the Sea Dragon King to help and extinguish the heavenly punishment of the Jing kingdom. The small restaurant was now crowded with people. The destruction of the Zhao kingdom was a big deal to them. Because the Zhao kingdom had always been stronger than the Wu kingdom. Even the Zhao kingdom was destroyed by the Qi kingdom. If the Qi kingdom pointed its blade at them, would the Wu kingdom be able to withstand it? In a very short time, the whole restaurant was in a state of panic. In a remote corner of the restaurant, Li Yi withdrew his gaze from the crowd. The Zhao kingdom was gone, the Jing kingdom had been defeated, the heavenly punishment had fallen into the hands of Zhao Yi. He and Ru Yi had only come out for a short while, and this world had already undergone such a huge change. He was not worried that Zhao Yi could figure out the formula of heavenly punishment. In fact, Zhao Yi should have known the materials needed to make heavenly punishment. The important thing was the proportion. The Zhao kingdom should have collected a lot of heavenly punishment from the battlefield. It was not meaningful to get the heavenly punishment this time. He did not know how many heavenly punishments the Jing kingdom had brought this time. The more they brought, the more they would have to bear in the future. However, what was more important than the formula of heavenly punishment was the person Zhao Yi. Flying sand and stones, summoning wind and rain, this was the son of the plain. Chapter 1173. There was a famous battle in history called the Battle of Kuanyang. In the Battle of Kuanyang, Lu Xiu defeated Wang Mang's army of 400,000 with only 20,000 soldiers. This was a famous example of a battle in which one side defeated many. 20,000 people against more than 400,000. This seemed like an impossible task. However, in the Battle of Kuanyang, a meteor flew into the enemy's camp. During the battle, strong winds blew and torrential rain poured. In an extremely short period of time, many extremely bad weather conditions appeared. With the help of the celestial phenomenon, Lu Xiu won the Battle of Kuanyang, which seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Because of this, Emperor Guangwu of Han was jokingly called the Son of the Dimension and the Great Magister by later generations. Although Zhao Yi didn't summon meteors to help like Emperor Guangwu, the news of him inviting the Sea Dragon King had already spread to several countries. Li Yi didn't really believe in the Son of the Dimension and luck. However, he couldn't deny that Zhao Yi's luck was extremely good. Rui sat beside him and said softly, "Husband." Li Yi retracted his gaze and shook his head. "It's okay. We've finished eating and rested for the night. In less than 10 days, we'll reach the Wu Kingdom's imperial capital. He had expected the Qi Kingdom to defeat the Zhao Kingdom, but he didn't expect it to be so fast. They practically swept through everything in their way and headed straight for the Zhao Kingdom's imperial capital. Although they could conquer the Zhao Kingdom in an extremely short period of time, it exposed a bigger problem. After conquering the Zhao Kingdom, they would need to spend a lot of effort to suppress the rebels in the Zhao Kingdom. This would take a very long time. This wasn't Zhao Yi's style of doing things. A hint of doubt appeared on Li Yi's face. What was Zhao Yi so anxious about? Zhao Kingdom, Qiang. The original capital had become the capital of a fallen country. A month ago, Qiang City was conquered. The king of the Zhao Kingdom and his concubines, the royal family of the Zhao Kingdom, and all the officials were captured. Inside the palace, the officials gathered together once again. Your Majesty committed suicide for his country yesterday. A middle-aged scholar stood in front of the hall and said calmly, a fine bird chooses a good tree to nest in. Grand Tutor, the Zhao Kingdom has fallen. Why are you so stubborn? Ha ha ha. Opposite him, a white-haired old man threw his head back and laughed wildly. A loyal subject does not serve two masters. The Zhao Kingdom has fallen. His Majesty has died for his country. I, along with the Zhao Kingdom, will die with His Majesty. He turned around, looked at the crowd behind him, and shouted, who's going with this old man? A middle-aged official stepped forward and laughed. This lowly official is willing to go with Grand Tutor. A young official walked out and shouted, I'm willing to die with you. Since the country has fallen, your subjects shall die. The ministers of a fallen nation have no face to continue living. Let's go together. In an instant, more than 10 figures stepped forward. Fellow colleagues, this old man will take his leave first. The white-haired old man laughed, stamped his feet, and hit his head on a pillar in the hall. He died instantly. Grand Tutor's legs are not good. This lowly official will also go first. On the way to hell, he will have a walking stick. An official smiled, suddenly pulled out a guard's long saber, and cut his own neck. You are only a 5th-rank official. How dare you compete with me for the walking stick of the Grand Tutor? Another official snorted, picked up the long saber on the ground, put it to his neck, and cut it open. Your Majesty, I'm coming with you. Soon, more than 30 bodies were piled up in the hall. Even the surrounding guards had looks of horror on their faces. They couldn't help but distance themselves from the corpses. The middle-aged scholar watched them die one by one, with a calm expression on his face. When the last person shouted, "Die with the country," and stabbed his long saber into his own heart, the crowd was dead silent. Some people were angry, some were ashamed. But in the end, no one walked out. Cough. Cough. A few coughs came from outside the hall, and a figure slowly walked into the hall. The middle-aged scholar hurried forward and said worriedly, "Your Majesty." Zhao Yi waved his hand and refused his help. He looked at the corpses in the hall for a long time, then said, "Bury them." The middle-aged scholar nodded and bowed, "As you wish." A person walked in from outside the hall and said in a low voice, "Your Majesty, the envoy of the Jing Kingdom has arrived." Zhao Yi nodded and said, "Bring them to the side hall." The middle-aged scholar looked at him and said, "Your Majesty, you should rest for a while." The imperial physician said, "You can't continue like this." Zhao Yi waved his hand and said in a hoarse voice, "It's okay." The middle-aged scholar's expression changed. He looked at him but did not say anything. In a side hall of the imperial palace, several officials of the Jing Kingdom were waiting anxiously. This time, the number of soldiers of the Jing Kingdom who had been captured by the Qi Kingdom was more than 10,000. When they learned the news, they didn't wait for the imperial court's order and rushed here day and night. They had to bring back these 10,000 soldiers in one piece no matter what. It was 10,000 lives. It was not hard to imagine what harsh conditions the Qi kingdom would offer. This would be an invisible war, and the success or failure of the war depended on them. The door of the side hall was pushed open. They immediately stood up and looked at the door. It was a young man who walked in. Judging by his age, he should be about the same age as their Majesty. But his face was a bit pale, and his steps were a bit unsteady. It seemed that he was not in good health. The leader was about to say something. Zhao Yi waved his hand and asked, "You are here for the captives?" "Yes." The man looked serious and said in a deep voice, "We are here to redeem the 10,000 soldiers of the Jing kingdom. Please give us a condition, Emperor Qi." Zhao Yi was silent for a while. He looked at him and asked, "Do you have a penny?" The ambassadors of the Jing kingdom walked out of the side hall. The sunlight outside sprinkled on them, and they became a little more clear-headed. One of them suddenly looked at his companion and said, "Lord Qin, slap me and see if it hurts." "Paw!" The man slapped him hard on the face without hesitation. Then he lowered his head and looked at his hand, murmuring, "It hurts." "It's real." Half of the official's face immediately swelled up. Blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. One of his teeth even loosened. He looked at Lord Qin with a bewildered expression. The official with the surname Qin patted him on the shoulder. He looked at his bewildered expression and said, "Lord Wei, you don't have to doubt it. What happened just now was real." He knew why Lord Wei was bewildered. It was because he was also bewildered. They had long been convinced that the Qi kingdom would have to pay a great price to release the 10,000 captives. The Qi kingdom would certainly offer a condition that they could not imagine. The condition that the Qi kingdom offered was indeed beyond their imagination. The condition was a penny. 1 copper coin could not buy a loss, and 1 copper coin could not buy a trick. 1 copper coin could bring all the captives back. Those captives had been detained for nearly 2 months. During these days, their food and expenses added up to a terrifying figure. However, Emperor Qi did sign the document for the release of the captives only after paying them a penny. They only needed to bring this document with them to bring all the generals of the Jing kingdom back home. This negotiation mission had been completed beyond imagination. Not to mention the rewards he would receive when he returned, he could even look forward to having his name recorded in the annals of history. The two left in a hurry without thinking too much. Before Emperor Qi went back on his word, they had to settle this matter in the shortest time possible. By the time they brought all the generals and soldiers out of here, it would be too late for him to go back on his word. In the side hall, Zhao Yi sat alone in front of a table. In front of him was a huge map. On the map, it was clearly divided into 4 regions. The Jing kingdom, the Wu kingdom, the Qi kingdom after annexing the Zhao kingdom, and the dozens of small countries in the west. Among them, the Qi kingdom was the largest. It was almost the size of the Jing kingdom and the Wu kingdom combined. The dozens of small countries in the west were also the size of the Wu kingdom. His eyes fell on the westernmost region. Then he began to cough. He covered his mouth and coughed hard, spitting out a mouthful of blood. Chapter 1174. In the imperial palace of the Zhao kingdom, the generals of the Qi kingdom gathered in front of a palace. Inside the palace, an old man with white hair and beard stood in front of the bed. He said solemnly, "Your Majesty, you can't go on like this." Zhao Yi's face was as pale as a piece of paper. He smiled and looked at the old man. He asked calmly, "How much longer do I have?" The old man lowered his head and thought for a while. He said, "If your Majesty can stop, I can extend your life for another 1.5 years. A general walked in from outside the palace and said anxiously, "Your Majesty, how can you release the prisoners of the Jing kingdom just like that? Get out." Before Zhao Yi could speak, the old man turned his head and said coldly to him, The general looked at him, shrank his head, and walked out dejectedly. Outside the palace, a general glanced at him and said, Dr. Hua said not to let those trifles disturb His Majesty's thoughts and waste his energy. Why are you going to join in the fun at this time? The general showed an unconvinced expression and said, That's 10,000 people. Even if we can't exchange them for divine punishment from Jingguo, we can still exchange them for a lot of other things. These days, they've eaten a lot of our food. Have you calculated how much we've lost if His Majesty just let them go like this? Is this the first time you understand His Majesty's character? The general looked at him and said, It is because they are from the Jing kingdom that His Majesty released them. Hearing this, the general sighed and said no more. When the crown prince besieged the city, His Majesty, as the third prince, owed that person a huge favor. Given His Majesty's character, he would naturally return the favor. Speaking of which, compared to the fool who gave the Qi kingdom to His Majesty, the 10,000 prisoners that His Majesty gave to the Jing kingdom were really not enough. Thinking of this, His Majesty felt much better. He could only let out a long sigh as he watched a huge piece of meat slip away from their mouths. In the palace, the old man looked at Zhao Yi and said seriously, Your Majesty, let's stop here. I will do my best to nurse Your Majesty's body, don't worry. Zhao Yi smiled and said, Our journey has just begun. I don't want to die yet. He looked outside and said, When Mr. Hua goes out, call them in. The old man frowned. Your Majesty, Zhao Yi smiled. Just a few words. The old man looked at him and could only sigh in the end. He walked to the door and glared fiercely at the generals, saying, After you go in, be careful what you say. If His Majesty's condition worsens, I won't forgive you. A few of the Qi kingdom's generals, who were known for their decisiveness on the battlefield, lowered their heads and nodded in agreement. They would rather offend Her Majesty than miracle Dr. Hua, because no one knew what kind of suffering awaited them if they offended miracle Dr. Hua, who was known for his narrow-mindedness. When they walked into the hall, Zhao Yi had already gotten up from his bed and was looking at the huge map. He looked at the generals who came in and said, I'll leave the rest to you. In an instant, several of them half knelt on the ground and shouted, We will obey Your Majesty's decree. The Jing Kingdom. An urgent letter had arrived at the front, causing the morning court session to last an hour longer than usual. An official stood in front of the hall and asked in surprise, Your Majesty, the Qi kingdom has released him without any request. Could there be a trap? We have to be on our guard. Another official stood up and said, Lord Qin and the others have already brought him back to the Jing kingdom. What other tricks could there be? Perhaps the Qi kingdom is afraid of the Jing kingdom's prestige and is showing weakness. I think it's highly possible. In the court, as the officials were discussing, the capital governor, Lu Dao, walked out from the crowd. He cleared his throat and took out a piece of paper from his sleeve, saying, I've done some research a few days ago. Why don't you take a look? There was no one in the imperial court who didn't know that this capital governor didn't seem to reveal himself. He might not say a single word in the imperial court for several months on end, but every time he did speak, it was always to the point, even earth-shattering. Therefore, they were still a little afraid of this Lord Lu. The piece of paper he took out this time did not contain any profound or esoteric remarks, but a few sets of simple numbers. The Qi kingdom, the Jing kingdom, the Wu kingdom, and the destroyed Zhao kingdom accounted for 60% of the famous generals who were active on the battlefield and were well known to the world. From the time the Qi kingdom attacked the Zhao kingdom to the time the Zhao kingdom was destroyed, only 4 months had passed. Before the appearance of Tianfa, the Qi kingdom and the Jing kingdom had fought dozens of battles, big and small, and the Jing kingdom had lost 80% of the battles. After the Qi kingdom destroyed the Zhao kingdom, it launched a large-scale expedition to the west. As of today, 7 small countries in the west have been incorporated into the territory of the Qi kingdom. This thin piece of paper and the data recorded on it were like a vicious slap to the faces of all the courtiers in the hall. This piece of paper told them that without Tianfa, the Jing kingdom's military strength was far inferior to the Qi kingdom's. In recent years, the Jing kingdom's economy had taken off, and the people's lives were stable. Basically, it had reached the peak since the founding of the country. In terms of military strength, with the advantage of Tianfa, the other countries were deterred. Even the Qi kingdom could not stop its edge. However, without Tianfa, there was not much difference between the Jing kingdom and the Zhao kingdom. If the Qi kingdom could conquer the capital city of the Zhao kingdom in just 4 months, it was possible that it could conquer the capital city in a year. Now, the Qi kingdom also had Tianfa. Although it was only a small number, if it was used on the Jing kingdom, they would definitely pay a very painful price. This slap woke up many of the officials in the court. It turned out that the Jing kingdom was not as powerful as they had imagined. It turned out that the Qi kingdom was still the invincible Qi kingdom. However, after destroying the state of Zhao and releasing the captives of the state of Jing, they actually continued to march westward without stopping. Could it be that this newly ascended emperor of the state of Qi was truly a madman? The court below was almost silent. Li Xian rubbed the area between his eyebrows, which was a little swollen, and murmured, "What is the surname Zhao doing?" When Li Yi learned that Zhao Yi had unconditionally released the captives of the Jing kingdom, he was already in a province of the Wu kingdom, which was only a day's journey away from the imperial capital. Was this a return of his favor? If he thought about it carefully, he had given Zhao Yi the Qi kingdom. Although the favor he returned was great, it was still not enough compared to the throne of the Qi kingdom. Zhao Yi had already conquered the Zhao kingdom, and was advancing toward his goal of ruling the world. When he completely conquered the 20 small countries in the west, there would only be the Jing kingdom, the Wu kingdom, and the super big Qi kingdom on this continent. Li Yi felt a little uncomfortable in his heart. She was the ruler of the entire world. Did she really think that she could conquer the entire world just because she said so? Why did it seem like a game to her? She was a huge country that could be conquered and destroyed as she pleased. Why hadn't she realized how formidable Zhao Yi was in the past? When she was trapped in the royal capital by Zhao Jing, she was just like a cowardly tortoise. Could it be that after giving away the throne of the Qi kingdom, he had awakened some mysterious attribute and was blessed with luck? Was he really going to become the next emperor to unify the world? It was no exaggeration to say that Li Yi had mixed feelings at this moment. If one day, Zhao Yi pointed his sword at the Jing kingdom or the Wu kingdom, what should he do? It was not that he was afraid of Zhao Yi, but he was ready to completely enter the life of retirement after a period of time. Fighting back and forth, he could not live a peaceful life. Chapter 1175. In a certain hall in the imperial palace of the Wu kingdom, Yang Liuqing placed a letter on the table and said, "Master, Uncle Master and the others should arrive tomorrow." Mississippi Lu put down the martial arts books collected by the royal family of the Wu kingdom and stood up to walk out of the palace. Yang Liuqing watched her walk out and sighed softly. She walked out of the hall and said to Chen Qing, who was waiting there, "Tomorrow, the 2 Uncle Masters will arrive at the imperial capital. I'll have to trouble General Chen to welcome them on my behalf." Chen Qing hurriedly said, "It's no trouble at all. I haven't seen Prince Jiang of Silla for a long time." Chen Qing had followed Yang Liuqing from the land of chaos and fought his way to the imperial capital. He was one of the important officials who assisted Yang Liuqing in his ascension to the throne. His status was equivalent to that of a founding general and was completely different from how it was a few years ago. Even when envoys from the Jing kingdom or the Qi kingdom came, he didn't need to personally go out of the city to welcome them. However, it was different this time. After receiving the order, he hurriedly left. If he didn't bring Wei Liang along to welcome Jiang of Silla tomorrow, he would probably not be finished with him in the future. He would also have to bring Blind Fan along. They had all received kindness and guidance from Jiang of Silla, so these etiquettes were necessary. Mississippi Lu returned to the hall and took out autumn water. She said to Yang Liuqing, I'll be away for a period of time. Even though you're tired from state affairs, you can't neglect your martial arts. This will be very beneficial to you. Yang Liuqing nodded and said, I understand. Not long after, the white-haired elder walked into the hall and asked in confusion, Why did your master leave? Yang Liuqing thought for a while and said, Master, she has some matters to deal with. Yang Wanli didn't pursue this matter and suddenly asked, I heard that Li Brat is coming. Yang Liuqing nodded and said, Martial uncle will arrive tomorrow. That's good. A smile appeared on Yang Wanli's face as he said, This kid has a lot of wicked ideas and a belly full of evil tricks. When the time comes, let him help you come up with more ideas. Li Yi had seen the capital cities of the Jing Kingdom, the Qi Kingdom, and the Wu Kingdom. Putting aside personal feelings, the capital of the Qi Kingdom should be the most imposing, at least from the outside. Of course, all in all, the capital was more prosperous. The Wu Kingdom's imperial city was the most wretched of the three. Along the way, Li Yi and Rui learned more about Wu Guogua. After a decade of turmoil, the Wu Kingdom wanted to restore its foundation. It was a long-term task and not something that could be done in a short period of time. Yang Liuqing had just ascended to the throne not long ago. Everything in the Wu Kingdom was waiting to be done. Although she had a small notebook that he had specially made for her, nothing could be done in one go. After the civil war ended, the Wu Kingdom's tianfa was no longer supplied to them in the fringe. Li Yi didn't think it was necessary in the past. But now, he might have to change his plan. Every few days, he would hear the news that the Qi Kingdom had annihilated a small country in the west. With the Qi Kingdom's current strength, it was only a matter of time before they swept through the countries in the west. When that time came, on this continent, only the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom would be left standing in his way of becoming the ruler of the world. If the Qi Kingdom went all out, the Wu Kingdom might not be able to win even with tianfa. If there was no tianfa, then the Zhao Kingdom might very well be a lesson for them. Of course, the Jing Kingdom wouldn't just watch as the Qi Kingdom annexed all the other countries. When that time came, it would truly be time for the reshuffling of the powers on this continent. He and Rui entered the city gate and asked for the location of the imperial palace. Then, they walked in that direction. Rui sighed softly and said, My husband wrote that letter first. If Rui knew that we've arrived, I'm afraid she would hide on purpose. Of course, Li Yi knew that Mississippi Lu would hide on purpose. But if she hadn't figured it out, even if he and Rui appeared without a trace, she would still leave, and it would be more serious than if she had taken the initiative to hide. Li Yi smiled and held her hand. He said, It doesn't matter. We have nothing to do anyway. We'll chase after her wherever she hides. When she's tired of hiding, she'll naturally come out. The imperial city of the Wu Kingdom was indeed shabby. The roads were full of potholes and sewage and garbage were everywhere. It couldn't even compare to a second-tier city in the Jing Kingdom, let alone the capital, which had all been replaced with cement roads. Even the main roads of the important cities in the Jiangyi region of the Qi Kingdom were paved with neatly cut bluestone slabs. Of course, this was also due to Li Yi's own negligence. The little notebook he gave to Yang Liuqing recorded mostly revolutionary experiences. He also touched a little on how to govern the country after seizing the fruits of victory. But there was no mention of these basic constructions. Get out of the way, get out of the way. A fine horse galloped from behind, and the pedestrians on the street all dodged to the side. Li Yi and Rui stood on the side of the street and frowned as they watched the young man on the horse galloping away with laughter. There was actually someone galloping wildly on a horse on the main street of the capital. How did Yang Liuqing become the empress? He bent over to help an old man who had accidentally fallen to the ground while dodging. He couldn't help but ask, There's someone galloping wildly on a horse on the streets of the imperial city. Doesn't the authorities care? The old man sighed and asked, Young master, you're not from here, are you? Lee nodded. There's something you don't know, young master. The old man looked ahead and said, that person on the horse just now is the young master of the Zhang family. There are several members of the Zhang family who are high-ranking officials in the imperial court. When His Majesty was suppressing that usurper, the Zhang family helped His Majesty a lot. How could the authorities dare to care about this kind of thing? Even if someone really died from the collision, it would be in vain. The His Majesty that the old man was talking about was naturally Yang Liuqing. When Yang Liuqing and the others attacked the imperial city of the Wu Kingdom, they actually didn't expend too much effort, and they didn't use heavenly punishment either. It could even be said that they didn't expend much effort. Because at that time, the original tyrant of the Wu Kingdom was already disloyal. The officials, nobles, and various great clans in the imperial city all wanted nothing more than to overthrow his tyranny. When Yang Liuqing and the others fought their way here, the gates of the imperial city were wide open, and the commoners lined the streets to welcome them. They very easily entered the imperial city. But this wasn't a reason for her to indulge these clans. Or perhaps she herself didn't know that these people were actually so arrogant in the imperial city. But no matter what the reason was, if her little martial nephew wanted to become a qualified empress, she still had a very long way to go. She still needed to train her well. There was no training. Mother, I want to eat candied hawthorn. On the streets of the imperial city, a little girl pointed at a hawker selling candied hawthorn in the middle of the street. She turned her head, looked at her mother, and begged. The woman took out 2 copper coins from her bosom, handed them to her, and said, I only have 2 copper coins. Go and ask how much 1 candied hawthorn costs. The little girl immediately revealed a smile, and her eyes curved into crescent moons. She ran to the middle of the street, opened her hand, and revealed the 2 copper coins in her hand. She said, Brother, I want 1 candied hawthorn. The hawker selling the candied hawkers was a youth about 17 or 18 years old. He held a stick in his hand, and on top of the stick was a raised haystack. The haystack was filled with candied hawthorns. He looked at the 2 copper coins in the little girl's hand, rubbed his head, and said with some embarrassment, My candied hawthorn, 3 copper coins each. The little girl's eyes instantly dimmed. She made an "oh" sound, and turned to walk outside. The youth stood in the courtyard, thought for a moment, and suddenly said, Little sister, wait a moment. He took a candied hawthorn from the haystack, handed it to her, and said, Forget it, I'll sell 1 to you for 2 copper coins. Don't tell anyone else. If I sell all of them for 2 copper coins, I'll lose money. The little girl immediately smiled, took the candied hawthorn, and nodded heavily, saying, Thank you, brother. The youth smiled, turned to leave, and shouted, Candied hawthorn, sour and sweet candied hawthorn. The little girl stood in the middle of the street, licked the candied hawthorn, and showed a happy smile. Get out of the way. On the street, the crowd dodged, and a fast horse galloped from behind. The woman looked at the little girl standing in the middle of the street, and her face instantly turned pale. She cried out involuntarily, Little girl. The little girl looked up and saw a big horse rushing towards her. Her body trembled, and the candied hawthorn in her hand fell to the ground. Bang! An extremely dull sound suddenly rang out. The horse fell to the ground, and its head was already broken, and it was no longer breathing. The youth on the horse flew straight out. After landing, his body bent in a strange way, and he lay on the ground, howling miserably. The young man selling the candied hawthorn looked at the scattered candied hawthorn on the ground, and his face showed a look of pity. The candied hawthorn scattered on the ground, and the haystack at the top of the stick also flew out. He pulled off the gray cloth that wrapped the stick, and everyone could see that it was not a wooden stick at all, but an iron stick as thick as a child's arm. It was also because of this that he was able to smash the horse to death with one strike. However, this youth was really strong, and such a thick iron stick in his hand seemed to be weightless. The little girl had already recovered from the shock, and she looked at the youth in a daze, and murmured, "Brother, you're so powerful as sun dashing." The youth was stunned when he heard this, and he turned the iron stick in his hand, and said embarrassedly, "Is that so? Actually, many people say that." Chapter 1176. Sun Dashing was a character in Journey to the West. The story and drama of Journey to the West could often be heard in the brothel. According to Journey to the West, Sun Dashing was omnipotent and omnipotent. He had the 72 transformations, the fiery eyes, and the somersault cloud. He was the envy of almost all children. Many boys held a wooden stick in their hands and shouted, "I, old Sun, am going." Then, they hypnotized themselves into thinking that they were Sun Wukong. Therefore, when that brother waved the stick in his hand and saved her, the little girl took it for granted that he was Sun Dashing. After being praised by the little girl, the young man's face turned slightly red. He looked at the candied fruits scattered on the ground and felt a little distressed. The woman had already rushed over at this moment. She held the little girl in her arms and asked worriedly, "Girl, are you okay?" The little girl raised her chubby little hand and wiped the tears off the woman's face. She said, "Mother, I'm fine. This big brother saved me." The woman came back to her senses and quickly looked at the young man. She said anxiously, "Benefactor, leave quickly. That person is the young master of the Zhang family. The Zhang family will definitely not let you off." The young man shook his head indifferently and said, "If they come to catch me, I'll beat them up. If they come, I'll beat them up. If they come, I'll beat them up. If they come, I'll beat them up. No matter how many come, I'll beat them up." "Benefactor," the woman looked anxious. Just as she was about to speak, there was already a commotion in front. A group of bailiffs separated the crowd and walked over. They said lazily, "What happened? Why are you all gathered here?" When the leader saw the young man lying on the ground, the laziness on his face suddenly disappeared. He said in panic, Mr. Zhang, what happened to you?" At this moment, Mr. Zhang had already fainted from the pain. One of them hurriedly squatted down. After checking, he licked his dry lips and said, "Detective Zhao, Mr. Zhang's limbs are all broken." Detective Zhao looked at Mr. Zhang's twisted limbs and said in a trembling voice, Is he still alive?" The man nodded and said, "He's still breathing." Detective Zhao kicked him hard and said, "Then what are you waiting for? Take Mr. Zhang to the doctor." After the two carefully carried the young man away, Detective Zhao looked around and said angrily, "Who did this?" A dead horse lay in the middle of the road. A young man stood in front of the horse's body. Arrestor Zhao estimated the distance between the horse's carcass and them. It was at least 5 to 6 feet away. No wonder young Master Zhang was in such a state. The fact that he didn't fall to his death from such a long distance was already a blessing. Zhang Qin. Thus, Chen's Shang Chen's Shan. He looked at the corpse of the horse lying on the ground, and then looked at the iron rod in the youth's hand. He was a little scared, but he forced himself to gather his courage and asked, "Did you do it?" The lad looked at him and said, "He galloped on the street and almost hurt a passerby." "Even so, you can't do that." Detective Zhao raised his voice. "If I don't stop him, his horse will kill someone." The teenager picked up the iron rod with one hand and put it down again. A deep pit appeared on the ground. Detective Zhao looked at the pit on the ground and whispered, but you can't hurt people like that." It was too late. The young man explained, "I only killed the horse. He flew out on his own." Detective Zhao widened his eyes and said, "If you don't kill the horse, will Mr. Zhang be able to fly out?" "I don't care." The youth looked at him, then at the passers-by around them, and said, "I didn't touch him. They can all testify." Detective Zhao had a headache. He looked at him and said, even if you didn't kill anyone, it's still wrong to kill a horse. Young hero, why don't you come with us to the yamen and we can talk about it? The young man shook his head and said, I won't go. There are no good people in the yamen. Detective Zhao looked at him and said, resisting arrest is a serious crime. The young man picked up the iron rod and spun it in his hand. He said, you guys come. I'm not afraid. The constables around him couldn't help but take a step back. They were afraid. The rod was obviously made of fine iron. When it was waved, it seemed to stir the air around it. Just looking at the mangled horse's head, one could tell how much strength was contained in that strike. They didn't think that their bodies were harder than the horse's head. Even a light scratch would break a few ribs. A constable looked at the woman and the little girl squatting on the ground and suddenly asked, you were the ones who were almost hit, right? The little girl nodded and said, Big Brother saved me. Big Brother is not a bad person. The constable looked at Detective Zhao, and Detective Zhao immediately understood. He looked at the woman and the little girl and said, since this matter is related to you, please come with me. The woman's expression changed. The young man took a step forward and stood in front of them. Detective Zhao's expression darkened. He said, are you going to defy the government? The young man looked down at the mother and daughter, and then at the constables opposite him. He said, I'll take responsibility for my own actions. It's not their fault. I'll go with you. Detective Zhao smiled and said, then I'll have to trouble you to come with us. The young man walked in front with the iron rod in his hand. Detective Zhao looked at the person behind him and said in a low voice, watch the mother and daughter. Don't let them escape. Then he pointed at another person and said, go to the Zhang mansion and report this. After making the arrangements, he looked up at the young man in front of him and twitched the corner of his mouth disdainfully. Did he really think he was Monkey's son just because he had an iron rod? When they arrived at the yamen, he wanted to see how arrogant he could be. After these people left, the crowd finally began to become noisy again. Sigh, this young man is good at martial arts, but he's too reckless. It's a pity that he offended the Zhang mansion. He shouldn't have gone to the yamen. He won't be able to get out of that place. The crowd felt sorry for the young man who had stood up at the critical moment with the iron rod in his hand. Behind the crowd, Li looked at Rui beside him and asked, am I seeing things? Why is that brat here? Rui was also a little surprised. Then she shook her head and said, I don't know what happened to him all these years, but he's really grown up. Li smiled and said, although this brat is a little naughty, he's still responsible. Let's go, or he'll suffer. Li nodded and looked in the direction where the constables had disappeared. He couldn't help but sigh. The son of heaven. Under the feet of a fairy, such a thing actually happened so brazenly. This martial nephew of his was really not a competent emperor at all. The two followed the constables to the yamen. At the city gate, Wei Liang, Chen Qing, and Fan Chao looked at the official road in front of them under the scorching sun. After an unknown amount of time, Fan Chao couldn't help but wipe his sweat and asked, did His Majesty get the time wrong? It's already this hour, why hasn't Jiang of Silla arrived yet? Chen Qing also wiped his sweat and said, let's wait a little longer, the Zhang mansion. The young man with broken limbs had woken up. However, it was better for him to be unconscious than to wake up. He lay on the bed and howled miserably. In the room, a woman was so sad that tears streamed down her face. She wiped her tears and looked at the middle-aged man beside her and cried, Master, who beat Chen up like this? We can't let him go. The middle-aged man walked to the bed with a sullen face and chopped the young man's neck with his hand. The room finally quieted down. He turned to look at the other young man and said, you handle this matter personally. Yes, father. The young man responded and walked out of the room. As he walked out of the mansion, he happened to bump into another person. The young man looked at him and said in surprise, "Where are you going?" "I was just about to find you for a drink. I have some matters to handle." The young man looked at the young man and said, "If you have nothing to do, why don't you come with me?" The young man nodded and said, "Then I have to hurry. My uncle has something to do today and left early. I don't know when he'll be back. I can't let him find out that I've sneaked out." Chapter 1177. Young hero, you are not allowed to bring weapons in the public hall. A constable walked to the young man's side and smiled apologetically. He was about to take away the thick metal rod in the young man's hand. The young man held the metal rod. The constable used all his strength, but the rod didn't budge at all. The constable opened his mouth. "Young hero, this," the young man finally let go. The constable used all his strength to lift the metal rod to the side. His face was flushed, and he looked at the young man with even more fear. A man in an official's robe sat in the court. He slapped the gavel and asked, "Who are you, and what crime did you commit?" Detective Zhao took a step forward and bowed. "Lord Zhou, this man committed a crime on the street and killed the steed of the young master of the Zhang family, severely injuring the young master of the Zhang family. I brought him back." The Zhou County magistrates looked at the young man and asked, "What's your name, criminal?" The young man looked at him and said calmly, "Liu Xiaohu." The Zhou County magistrate slapped the gavel again and said loudly, "Criminal Liu Xiaohu, why did you commit a crime on the street?" "He was galloping on the street," the young man explained. "He almost ran into someone. I only injured the horse, not the person." The Zhou County magistrate said angrily, "You directly injured the horse and indirectly injured the person. What's the difference?" "There's a difference," the young man said clearly. "He was galloping on the street, and anyone could have stopped him. I was saving someone, not injuring someone." The Zhou County magistrate was speechless. The young man was stubborn, but what he said made sense. How could anyone be allowed to gallop on the streets of the imperial capital? If the imperial guards encountered him, it wouldn't be too much to shoot him dead on the street. However, the problem was that the person galloping was the young master of the Zhang family. The Zhang family had contributed to the rise of the emperor, and they could do whatever they wanted in the imperial capital. Besides, now that the empress was in power, the bloodline of the Yang dynasty had already been completely exterminated by the dead tyrant, and only Her Majesty the Empress remained. The other half of the next emperor's bloodline would be chosen from an unknown noble family. How could he dare to offend the promising Zhang family? While the Zhou County magistrates were thinking about this, two people walked in from outside. When the court was in session, no one was allowed to walk around. The Zhou County magistrates looked angry. He had just picked up the gavel when he saw the faces of the two men. His heart skipped a beat and he gently put it down. He immediately walked down to the hall and said with a smile, "Mr. Zhang, Chen, both of you have graced us with your presence. I apologize for not going out to meet you." This Mr. Zhang was the eldest son of the Zhang family, so he had to treat him with caution. As for the other person, he was even more incredible. Chen Jun, Chen, was the nephew of Chen Qing, General Qin. General Qin followed the empress from Cangzhou to here and helped the empress ascend to the throne, so he was highly regarded by the empress. General Qin had no children, so he had always treated this nephew as his own son. Chen Jun's future was naturally limitless. The young man surnamed Zhang looked at the Zhou County magistrates and said indifferently, "My younger brother was assaulted on the street and is heavily injured. Father told me to come here and take a look. Lord Zhou, continue with the trial and don't worry about us." The Zhou County magistrates cursed in his heart. This little bastard said it so easily. What did he mean by "don't worry about them"? They were already standing here, so how could he not care? He smiled and ordered the bailiff behind him, "Bring 2 chairs for the 2 young masters." Then, he walked back to the hall again, slammed the gavel, and said angrily, "Offender Lu Xiaohu, you wantonly hurt people and seriously injured them. Do you admit to your crimes or not?" The young man looked at him and said, "I didn't hurt anyone." "How dare you quibble in front of the eyes of the public, with witnesses and material evidence?" The Zhou County magistrates looked angry. He took out a stick from the bucket, threw it down the hall, and said, 20 strokes first." Lu Xiaohu said unhappily, "I'm not guilty." "Why are you hitting me?" 2 bailiffs walked over from his side and pressed down on his shoulders. With a light flick of his hands, he directly threw the 2 bailiffs away. The Zhou County magistrates was shocked and said loudly, "You thief, how dare you cause trouble in the court? Quick, someone come and take him down." More than a dozen government runners rushed forward in a flurry. Naturally, Lu Xiaohu would not give up without putting up a fight. He directly lifted one of them and threw him at them. Immediately, several people were knocked down by him. The rest of the people stood rooted to the ground, not daring to take a step forward. This young man was as strong as a beast. More than 10 people could not hold him down. If they went up, they would only be beaten. Lu Xiaohu walked up to the iron bar, held it with one hand, and stomped it hard on the ground. Everyone felt the court shake. He glanced around and said, "You can all come at me together." Chen Jun and the young man surnamed Zhang sat on the side of the court. Seeing this scene, they could not help but not show panic or anger on their faces. Instead, they laughed. The Zhou County magistrates was not so happy. He was so angry that his voice was trembling. You are rebelling." He looked at the bailiff standing there, not moving forward, and angrily said, "What are you all standing there for? Hurry up and call more people over." There were only dozens of bailiffs in the county government, and not all of them were in the county government. In a short time, only about 20 people gathered. Looking at the young man standing in the court with the iron bar in his hand, no one dared to step forward. The iron bar in his hand was too frightening. He was not a human at all, but a beast. Seeing the stalemate, the Zhou County magistrates immediately walked down to the 2 young men and said awkwardly, "Mr. Zhang, Chen, you see, it's okay." Chen Jun smiled and said, "The city gate is a few hundred steps away from here. You can ask someone to call the guards here. Isn't that fine?" Hearing this, the Zhou County magistrates was stunned and immediately said, "I'll send someone right now." Chen Jun threw him a token and said with a smile, "It's more convenient to take this." "Thank you, young master." The Zhou County magistrates took the token and handed it to a bailiff. He said, Go ask the guards to help." On the other side, Detective Zhao looked at the young man and said in a trembling voice, You put down that iron bar. You're rebelling. Do you know that you'll be beheaded?" The young man was unmoved. He spun the iron bar with one hand, and the dozens of bailiffs were so scared that they took a step back again. "I haven't seen you for a few years. You brat, you've grown up." A voice came from behind. The bailiffs turned around and saw someone coming in. They immediately made way for him. Lu Xiaohu looked at the 2 figures coming in from outside. He couldn't believe it. After rubbing his eyes, the iron bar in his hand fell to the ground. "Ru, Sister Rui, brother-in-law," Li walked over and patted his head. He said, "I haven't seen you for so many years. You've grown so tall and strong." The iron bar in Lu Xiaohu's hand fell to the ground. When the 2 bailiffs saw this, they rushed forward, picked him up, and quickly carried him outside. The Zhou County magistrates looked at the bailiffs who were still in a daze and said loudly, "What are you waiting for? Take him down, dead or alive." When the bailiffs heard this, they drew their weapons and rushed forward. "Brother-in-law, be careful." Panic finally appeared on Lu Xiaohu's face. He stood in front of Li Yi to protect him. Li Yi smiled and walked in front of him. He grabbed a bailiff's knife and knocked 2 bailiffs unconscious with the back of the knife. On Rui's side, more than 10 bailiffs had already fallen. When the Zhou County magistrate saw this, his expression changed drastically. He blurted out, "He has accomplices." Chapter 1178. Within a few breaths, the bailiffs who had rushed into the court were all lying on the ground. Mr. Zhang and Chen Jun looked at each other. A smile appeared on the former's face and he said, "Interesting, interesting." The Zhou County magistrate's face was pale. He held the table and said in a trembling voice, Are you trying to rebel?" Li Yi ignored the Zhou County magistrates and walked to the 2 young men. He looked at them and said, "What are you waiting for? Get up." Mr. Zhang and Mr. Chen's expressions changed, and they stood up silently. At this time, they naturally would not try to be heroes. Those who tried to be heroes were all lying on the ground. Li Yi moved the 2 chairs over and sat with Rui. He asked Lu Xiaohu, "Why are you in the Wu Kingdom? Where are your parents?" "My parents died of illness a few years ago." Lu Xiaohu touched his head and said, "I was in the Jing Kingdom at first, helping someone to secure goods. They gave me a lot of money and provided me with meals on the way here. Later, when I came here, I found that the Tonghulu business here was good, so I didn't go back." Rui found it hard to believe and asked, "Second uncle and second aunt have passed away?" Lu Xiaohu lowered his head and said, "It's the plague. My parents were accidentally infected and later died." He looked at Li Yi and Rui and asked with a smile, "Sister Rui, brother-in-law, why are you here? Are Sister Rui and Sister Xiaohuan here too?" The Zhou County magistrates looked at the court from time to time and cursed in his heart. What is this? This is the court. They have just injured so many bailiffs, but now they are sitting there and chatting. Do they have any respect for the court? The faces of Mr. Zhang and Chen Jun completely darkened. Chen Jun looked outside and murmured, "Why are they not here yet?" At this moment, at the city gate, General Fan wiped the sweat off his forehead again and asked doubtfully, "Could Jiang of Silla and the others have already entered the city?" Wei Liang thought about it and nodded. "It's very possible." "You still have the cheek to say that." Fan Chao looked at him and said angrily, "If you didn't insist on changing your clothes and delayed us, we might have already reconnected." Chen Qing was about to speak when a commotion broke out behind him. He turned his head and saw a yeoman runner handing a token to a young general guarding the city. He strode over and asked, "What happened?" "General Chen." The young general looked at him and pointed at the yeoman runner. He cupped his fists and said, "He said that there are several thugs who intend to rebel and hurt people in the court. The county government is under their control. The Zhou County magistrate sent him to ask for help from us." "Rebel?" Chen Qing looked at the token and asked, "Is Chen Jun here too?" The yeoman runner immediately nodded and said, "Chen is also in the court." Chen Qing's face darkened. Chen Jun was the only descendant of the 3rd generation of the Qin family. He had high hopes for him. Fan Qiao and Wei Liang came over and asked, "What's the matter?" "Someone is attacking the county government." Chen Qing thought for a moment and said, "You wait here. I'll take some soldiers to have a look. After I solve the problem there, I'll go to the palace to see if Jiang of Silla has arrived. I'll go with you." General Fan looked up at the sun and said, "Old Wei, you stay here alone. Keep your dog eyes open and watch carefully. Don't miss it." After he finished speaking, he pointed at the young general and said, "Go and get 100 people to come with us." The young general immediately cupped his hands and said, "Yes, sir." Among the Lu family members who left the village, Li Yi and Rui had only seen Lu Mei and Xiaohu. Lu Mei's parents were killed by mountain bandits. Lu Xiaohu's parents also died of illness a few years ago. They didn't know how the others were doing. The grudges of the past were naturally not worth mentioning now. The naughty child who would sneak into the mountains to look for Sun Wukong when he heard about the Monkey King and was beaten by his mother to the point that he could only stand and listen to stories for several days had grown up into the young man in front of them. Suddenly, there was a rush of footsteps at the gate of the county government. The Zhou County magistrates, who had been anxious for a long time, suddenly felt refreshed and said with joy, "They're here." Zhang Can and Chen Jun smiled at the same time. A group of soldiers with bows and arrows ran in from outside and surrounded the court. "Where are the rebels?" A rough voice came from outside the door. After Yang Liuqing ascended the throne, he sent someone to deliver a few plates to the Wu Kingdom, saying that it would be convenient for him to act in the Wu Kingdom. Li Yi's hand had reached to his waist and touched the plate, but he took it back when he heard the voice. Fan Chao strode in from outside the door and saw the two people sitting in the hall as soon as he looked up. Plop! His eyes widened, and he paused and tripped over the threshold of the court. Chen Jun knew Fan Chao. He didn't expect that General Fan would come in person, so he hurried forward and said, "Uncle Fan, why are you here?" Fan Chao didn't pay attention to him. He quickly got up from the ground and ran to Li Yi, saying in surprise, "Your Highness Jiang of Silla, why are you here?" Jiang of Silla. Chen Jun was stunned. The man named Zhang Can looked puzzled. At this time, there were no kings in the Wu Kingdom. Which king was this Jiang of Silla? The Zhou County magistrates ran over excitedly and stopped with a pale face. Jiang of Silla. No matter which Jiang of Silla he was, he knew that he had made trouble today just by looking at General Fan's attitude. With the one-eyed general's temper, even if the master of the Zhang family was standing here, he wouldn't have such an attitude. Before Chen Jun could come back to his senses, he saw his uncle walking in from the door. He was shocked and immediately walked forward, bowed and said, "Second uncle." His uncle, who had always been strict with him but was extremely protective of him at the critical moment, didn't look at him at this moment. He walked straight in, half knelt on the ground and said respectfully, "Chen Qing greets your Highness Jiang of Silla." Fan Chao came back to his senses and half knelt on the ground as well. He cupped his hands and said, "Fan Chao greets your Highness Jiang of Silla." If it was just a king of the Jing Kingdom, they naturally didn't need to pay such great respect. But the problem was, Jiang of Silla was His Majesty's martial uncle. The reason why His Majesty could eliminate the rebels and successfully ascend the throne was 90%, no, more than 90%, was because of Jiang of Silla. If it wasn't for Jiang of Silla, they, including His Majesty, would have died in Sangzhou. Chen Jun's body swayed and he felt that his vision was a little dark. Why didn't he stay at home today? Why did he want to come out for a drink? Why did he accompany Zhang Can to watch the show? Why did he give the token to the Zhou County magistrates? Even if he didn't do any of these things, he wouldn't have seen his uncle treat that person so respectfully. Since he had nothing better to do just now, he was thinking about how many ways these rebels would die. "Get up." Li Yi waved his hand, stood up, and asked, "Why are you here?" General Fan said, "His Majesty asked us to go out of the city to pick you up. We heard that there was a change in the county government, so we immediately rushed over, leaving Wei Liang to wait there alone." After he finished speaking, he strode out of the hall and said, "Put away your weapons." Then he pointed at another person and said, "You, go outside the city and call General Wei over." When he heard, "His Majesty asked us to go out of the city to pick you up," the Zhou County magistrate's legs turned to jelly and he fell to the ground. What kind of person could make His Majesty order General Qin, General Wei, and General Fan, the three most famous generals, to go out of the city to pick you up at the same time? Just a moment ago, he gave the order to kill them regardless of their lives. The Zhang family is trying to kill me. As for Mr. Zhang, his expression changed, and a trace of worry rose in his heart. After Chen Qing got up, he looked at the yamen runners and constables in disorder outside, looked at Li Yi in confusion, and asked, "Your Highness, this. What's going on?" After a moment, his face darkened. He looked at Chen Jun and said angrily, "Get over here." Chapter 1179. Wei Liang and Chen Qing belonged to the military, so they couldn't directly intervene in political affairs. According to the laws of the Wu Kingdom, the young master of the Zhang family should be sentenced to death. Of course, laws were laws. If they were actually implemented, they would only be punished with a considerable amount of silver. This amount of silver was nothing to those large families, but the significance of this matter was not just a fine of silver. It was an act of not taking the Empress of Yangliuqing seriously. In the Jing Kingdom, even the most powerful foppish young master of a family, even the prosperous Chui family, didn't dare to wantonly ride horses on the streets of the capital. Chen Qing cupped his hands at Li Yi and said, "Jiang of Silla, don't worry. I will report this matter to His Majesty. We won't let this matter go." Li Yi nodded. The foppish young master who rode horses on the streets wasn't the main point. The main point was that the families behind him had nothing to fear. If the Zhang family was just one of the many families in the capital, then it was very necessary for him to come this time. Wei Liang looked at him and said, "Your Highness, let me take you to the palace." His Majesty should have been waiting for a long time. Li Yi turned to look at Lu Xiaohu and asked, "Xiaohu, where do you live?" Lu Xiaohu picked up the iron rod and said, "It's nearby." Li Yi thought about it and said, "Then let's go to your house first." "Ah." Lu Xiaohu was startled. He seemed to think of something and couldn't help but blush. Li Yi looked at Wei Liang and said, "Let's go take a look first. We won't delay anything." Wei Liang nodded and said, "Then I'll send someone to inform His Majesty." Chen Qing kicked Chen Jun and said angrily, "You are familiar with this place. Follow His Highness and lead the way." Chen Jun's heart was filled with fear. Now that he had finally heaved a sigh of relief, he obediently followed behind them. In the county government office, the Zhou County magistrates slumped on the ground, still in a daze. General Fan couldn't help but kick him and shouted, "Investigate this matter thoroughly, strictly." The Zhou County magistrates shivered and immediately said, "Yes, yes, yes. I will investigate this matter thoroughly and handle it impartially." Inside the county government, Mr. Zhang had quietly left without anyone noticing. Along the way, Li Yi and Rui asked Lu Xiaohu a few more questions. Soon, they arrived at a shabby alley. When they reached the entrance of the alley, they could hear noises of quarreling. In the depths of the alley, in front of a dilapidated house, a green-clothed manservant looked at the young girl in coarse clothes and said with a smile, "I say, Xiaonyang, why do you have to do this? What's so good about following that Tonghalu seller? Why don't you follow my young master? In the future, you will enjoy endless glory and wealth. Your sick mother will also be able to live a happy life with you." A young man pulled her sleeve and said, "What's so good about that Tonghalu seller? He's just a poor man. How can I not be compared to him?" The young girl looked flustered and quickly said, You let go of me, I won't go with you. I don't have much patience left." The young man looked at her coldly and said, "Don't refuse a toast only to drink a forfeit. Let go of her." Lu Xiaohu took a few steps forward and pushed the young man away. "Brother Xiaohu." When the young girl saw him, her face lit up and she quickly hid behind him. "How dare you push me?" The young man was pushed a few steps back and fell to the ground. He got up angrily and was about to say something when he saw a familiar figure in front of him. He said in surprise, "Young Master Qin, why are you, young my ass?" Chen Jun was almost scared to death. He quickly ran out and kicked the young man away. He was already unlucky enough today. He finally had the chance to sneak out for a drink, but he was scolded for no reason and was kicked by the uncle that he was most afraid of. Now that this guy was calling him, did he think that he had not died a horrible death? Chen Jun was born in a family of generals and had a foundation in martial arts. When the young man was kicked away, he felt his stomach churning and his internal organs tangled together. He raised his head and said with difficulty, "Young Master Chen, stop calling me that." Chen Jun was furious. He sat on the young man and slapped him left and right. He said angrily, "I don't even know you, why are you trying to get close to me?" When no one was paying attention, he chopped the young man's neck with his hand. The world was finally quiet. The young man's servant was shivering in fear. Li Yi walked over and looked at Lu Xiaohu and the young girl. He asked, "Are you married?" Lu Xiaohu hurriedly said, Not yet." The young girl blushed and looked at Lu Xiaohu for help. Lu Xiaohu immediately introduced, Qiao, this is Sister Rui, and this is brother-in-law. I've mentioned them to you before." The young girl named Qiao immediately bowed and said, "Greetings, sister, brother-in-law." Li Yi finally understood why this guy stayed in Wu Kingdom and refused to go back. It turned out that it was not because Wu Kingdom's Tonghulu sold well, but because Wu Kingdom's wives were easy to find. The young girl named Qiao was the one he met when he came to Wu Kingdom to deliver goods. At that time, he was not familiar with the people and the place in Wu Kingdom. He was cheated of money and had no place to eat. This young girl gave him a steamed bun, and then he stayed at her house and refused to leave. Li Yi looked at the young man who was being ridden by Chen Jun. In the current capital city, this kind of forceful kidnapping of a woman was not something that happened often anymore. Of course, the capital a few years ago was not much different from here. There were also many trash like Qinyu. But in recent years, the laws of the Jing Kingdom were becoming more and more perfect. The playboys were still playboys, but their bottom line had been greatly increased. At most, they would flirt with women verbally, but they did not dare to do anything more outrageous. Shanning's Women's Union had dealt with countless playboys in the past few years. But once human lives were involved, even if they were ordinary people or beggars, Lu Yi would teach them a good lesson. On the first day he came here, in the first hour, he already knew that Yang Liuqing, the Empress, had a lot of things to do. If the Wu Kingdom wanted to continue to develop and become stronger, there was still a long way to go. Chen Qing's nephew was very perceptive. He arranged a new residence for the young girl at once and asked a doctor to come over. After settling them down, Li Yi looked at Wei Liang and said, "Let's go." In the Zhang family. The young man named Zhang told them what happened in the county government just now with a serious face. Jiang of Silla. The master of the Zhang family looked puzzled and said, "How can there be a Jiang of Silla in the Wu Kingdom?" "Father, although we don't know who this Jiang of Silla is, the three generals, Chen Qing, Fan Qiao, and Wei Liang, all show great respect to him, and they even mentioned His Majesty." The young man was silent for a moment and then said again, "We have to be on guard." "Yes, we have to make some preparations." The middle-aged man nodded and said, "But don't worry too much. What can a prince from another country do? Will His Majesty do something to our Zhang family because of such a small thing?" The young man was slightly relieved. In the imperial capital, all the great clans were closely related to each other and shared honor and disgrace. Pulling one hair could affect the whole body. When Her Majesty had entered the imperial capital, she had been of great help to her. It was likely that she would not easily burn the bridge after crossing it. The master of the Zhang family walked out of the room and raised his head again. He couldn't help but murmur, "Who on earth is this Jiang of Silla? Marshal uncle, you're here." At the gate of the palace, Yang Liuqing came out to welcome them in person and bowed slightly to Li Yi and Rui. Li Yi waved his hand and said, "You're the Empress now. You have to pay attention to what you do. You don't have to bow in the future." Yang Liuqing smiled and said, "Marshal uncle will always be marshal uncle." She was as stubborn as Rui. Li Yi didn't continue this topic with her. He looked at her and asked, "Where's Rui? Is she in the palace?" Yang Liuqing lowered his head and said, Master left yesterday. He didn't expect Rui to continue hiding. Li Yi shook his head and then looked at Yang Liuqing. He said, Go in first. There are still some things I need to discuss with you. Chapter 1180. Li Yi indeed had a lot to say to Yang Liuqing. She not only had to conquer the world, but she also had to learn how to bring peace to the world. The latter was more difficult and more important than the former. She had already sat on the throne of the Empress, but this was not the end, but the beginning. Ruling a country did not rely on divine weapons, nor did it rely on divine punishment. If she wanted to sit on this throne for a long time, she had to learn these things. Li Yi walked to a hall and sat down. When he was about to speak, he saw Yang Liuqing standing there. He was startled and said, Sit. Yang Liuqing shook her head and said, Uncle Master, please teach me. I can just stand and listen. What Li Yi wanted to say was actually a reprimand, but her attitude was so proper that he could not say it. After all, she was no longer the little disciple of Rui, but the empress of a country. Although he had not been polite to the emperors of the Jing kingdom and the Qi kingdom, she was still one of his people. Li Yi's heart softened a little. He coughed softly and said, You can sit first. Yang Liuqing sat opposite him, raised her head, and looked at him seriously. He did not feel it before, but now that she was looking at him like this, Li Yi felt a little uncomfortable. He did not know what he wanted to say for a moment. He remembered it. As the capital of the Wu Kingdom, the infrastructure of the imperial capital had to be paid attention to. Whose streets in the imperial capital were full of foul-smelling ditches and potholes. One could die from the jolting in a carriage around the city. Moreover, the crowded streets were not a place for a horse to ride. What if the horse bumped into someone? Even if it did not bump into anyone, it would be wrong to bump into flowers and plants. Moreover, the parents of the Jing county colluded with the big clans in the city, inverted right and wrong, and misjudged cases. Was this the style that the imperial capital should have? The imperial capital was like this, not to mention other places. How did she become the empress? Thinking of this, Li Yi looked at her and saw that she was looking at him sincerely. Li Yi looked at her and thought for a moment before asking, The emperor and the princess are different. They have to worry about both the big and small things. This is your first time coming into contact with these things. Have you gotten used to it? Yang Liuqing lowered his head and said, I wasn't used to it at first, but I gradually got used to it. Nothing can be accomplished at once. Li Yi stood up, patted her on the shoulder, and comforted her. Take it step by step. Take it one step at a time. Yang Liuqing looked up at him and asked, Martial uncle, what should I do? Li Yi did not like to be a teacher, but when his own martial nephew looked at him like this and treated him as a pillar of support, he felt somewhat satisfied. His first impression of the imperial capital was that it was dirty and messy. Not only was this related to the reputation of the country, but it could also easily lead to more problems. To become rich, first build roads. To rule the country, first build roads. For the people of Rui City and Shuzhou, this idea had already been ingrained into their bones. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, First repair the roads in the imperial capital. Easy for you to say. An old voice came from outside the hall. The old man called Yang Wanli walked in and looked at him. He said, The savings of the national treasury have long been used up by that traitor. The court can't even pay the salaries of the officials. Where do we have the money to do these things? Will you give it to me? Why hadn't Li Yi realized before that this old man Yang Wanli was so shameless? The Wu kingdom belonged to the Yang family, not the Wu kingdom of the Li family. What right did he have to give money? His shamelessness already had some of the demeanor of Li Xian. Imperial granduncle. Yang Luqing walked in front of Li Yi and shook his head at Yang Wanli. Li Yi had always felt that any problem that could be solved with money was not a problem, because making money was not a problem at all. The same method had been used in the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. There was no reason why it couldn't work in the Wu Kingdom. Yang Wanli looked at Li Yi's expression and was delighted. He immediately said, "Do you have some bad ideas again?" The Zhang family. The head of the Zhang family had just been fined a large sum of money by the court because his youngest son had let his horse loose on the street. The money was small, but his reputation was important. The head of the Zhang family sat in the hall with a gloomy expression. Before he finished his cup of tea, a figure rushed in from outside. "Big brother, something bad has happened." The head of the Zhang family looked at the middle-aged man who had rushed in from outside and frowned. "What's the matter? Why are you so flustered?" The middle-aged man said anxiously, "Big brother, the court just sent someone over and took away all the accounts of the Ministry of Revenue." The head of the Zhang family glanced at him and said indifferently, "If they took them away, so be it. The accounts of the Ministry of Revenue are checked several times every year. Do you think they can find anything this time?" The reason why the Zhang family was able to stand tall in the Wu Kingdom was not just because of the family's foundation that had been accumulated over the decades. Aside from the ministers, a small half of the officials in the Ministry of Revenue were students of the Zhang family. The income of the national treasury was controlled by the Zhang family. Seeing the head's indifferent expression, the middle-aged man felt slightly relieved. However, he still said hesitantly, "I don't know why, but I feel that this time is a little different." "What difference can it be?" The middle-aged man thought about it and asked, "If they really find out what we've done to the accounts all these years, what should we do?" "All right, don't scare yourself." The head of the Zhang family waved his hand and said, "Every year, the people I invite to do the accounts are all accountants who are proficient in mathematics. Their methods are extremely brilliant. There are so many accounts in the Ministry of Revenue. They won't be able to find anything even if they investigate until next year." Less than 5 days after the young master of the Zhang family, Zhang Qin, had ridden a horse on the streets, the Zhang family was investigated by the court. Including the head of the Zhang family, close to 100 people were all imprisoned. It was said that the Zhang family had been in charge of the Ministry of Revenue for many years and had embezzled millions of taels of silver from the national treasury. The value of the property seized from the Zhang family was unknown. A powerful family of a generation had collapsed in a single night. In the next half a month, within the imperial city, the number of large and small families that had been investigated were innumerable. These families had committed many evil deeds, and they were no better than the children of the Zhang family who had ridden a horse on the streets. However, no one had been able to deal with them, and the common people had suffered greatly. For a time, everyone in the imperial city was clapping and cheering. The major families that were temporarily at peace with each other were also panicking. For the first time, they discovered that the actions of this empress, who had just ascended to the throne not long ago, were not as weak as those of ordinary women. She acted swiftly and decisively, and did not leave any face. The families that had been investigated were all the mansions of officials who had been found guilty of corruption. Those that had not been found did not dare to be completely at ease. Even a family like the Zhang family had collapsed just like that. With General Wei Liang personally leading a group of people to investigate, regardless of whether the Zhang family really deserved to be punished for their crimes or the fact that the empress, who had already ascended to the throne, had hidden away her good bow and was preparing to act against these large families, the entire sky above the imperial city was covered with a layer of dark clouds. In fact, Li Yi had long discovered that although Yang Liuking's martial arts were high, her status was also high, and she looked very strong on the outside, there was still a weakness that belonged to a woman in her heart. She held military power in her hands. When facing those disobedient large families in the imperial city, she did not need any reason. In fact, she could use force to suppress them. Why would there be a need to investigate the accounts? Of course, the former method would not win the hearts of the people, so Li Yi did not advocate it. If it were not for the fact that he and Rui wanted to spend some alone time together, it would have been a good choice to bring Mingzu along. The current Yang Liuqing, except for the fact that she had the crown of an empress, was actually in a similar situation compared to Mingzu in the past. The path that Mingzu had taken was the path that she was going to take now. Of course, compared to Mingzu, she was much luckier. She did not need to take any detours. Everything went according to plan. The current Jing kingdom would be the future Wu kingdom. When Yang Wanli walked in from outside, his expression was a little ugly. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "Do you know the emperor of the Qi kingdom?" Li Yi nodded and said, "He can be considered a good friend." "That friend of yours has already destroyed half of the small countries in the west," Yang Wanli said with a dark expression. "What on earth does he want?" "The ruler of the world," Li Yi said casually and continued to help Yang Liuqing write the strategy for the empress. "What?" Yang Wanli looked shocked. "This person has such great ambitions." Li Yi raised his head and said, "Otherwise, why would he destroy the Zhao kingdom and the western countries so quickly? Is he so free?" Yang Wanli looked at Li Yi and asked, "What about the Wu kingdom?" "The Wu kingdom." Li Yi put down his pen and said, "Maybe after the countries in the west are destroyed, it will be the Wu kingdom's turn when they are free." Yang Wanli looked worried and murmured, "If he really destroys those countries, how powerful will the Qi kingdom become? Even with the heavenly punishment, we are not a match for the Qi kingdom." Li Yi did not say anything. Yang Wanli looked at him for a long time and suddenly smiled. He said, "Brat, you won't sit back and do nothing, right?" Li Yi looked at him and said in surprise, "Shouldn't this be something your Wu kingdom should worry about?" Yang Wanli looked at him and said with a cold smile, "Don't think I don't know what you are planning. At this time, you should just admit it." Li Yi was stunned and asked, "What should I admit?" "My young royal family has no young male descendants. You made Qing her the empress so that one day, don't slander me." Li Yi suddenly stood up and pointed at him. Yang Wanli looked at him and said, "I haven't finished speaking." "You haven't." Li Yi was stunned and then said, "Then continue." Chapter 1181. Yang Wanli was puzzled by Li Yi's sudden agitation. He thought for a moment, looked at him, and asked, "Let me ask you, is there no more males in our young royal family?" Li Yi looked at him for a long time, and couldn't help but ask, "When was it cut?" Yang Wanli's eyes narrowed, and he suddenly asked, "You haven't become a grandmaster yet, right?" Li Yi smiled, and said, "Even if you are a grandmaster, you are still not a match for my wife, right?" Yang Wanli sneered, "If you are a man, don't mention your wife. You are still not a match for my second Mississippi, you are still not a match for my Mingzu." Li Yi thought for a moment, and then added, "You still don't know who Mingzu is, right? But this is not important. You are not a match for Rui, so you are not a match for Mingzu." As a grandmaster expert that was 1 in a million, Yang Wanli suddenly felt a bit sad. He was not a match for the Lu sisters, not a match for Su Tian, not a match for Tian Dan, and Su Tian said he was also not a match for the eunuch surnamed Chang. Now there was one more. What use did he have for the title of Grandmaster? He took a deep breath, and with great difficulty, he calmed his emotions, and said, "I mean, other than me." Li Yi wanted to remind him that there was still someone called Yang Fu, but although Yang Fu could still be called a person in nature, he was dead in society, so Li Yi didn't mention him again. He nodded, and said, "You can only blame your grandnephew for being too ruthless. If the previous emperor of the Wu kingdom hadn't killed all of the members of the royal family in order to clear away threats, Yang Liuqing's ascension to the throne wouldn't have been so smooth." Yang Wanli continued, "There are no males in the Yang royal family, but the next emperor of the Wu kingdom must have the blood of the royal family, so he must be Qin, Er's child. Li Yi nodded. What old man Yang said made sense, but what did this have to do with whether he admitted it or not? Old man Yang looked at him with a look of understanding, and said, Qing likes you, so her child can only be your child. Li Yi's heart skipped a beat. He pointed at him and shouted, Don't talk nonsense. Was this old man out of his mind? Yang Liuqing was Rui's disciple, his junior nephew. This was a mess. No matter how much of a beast he was, he would never have designs on her. Not yet. I don't blame you. You don't have to deny it. Old Yang looked at him and suddenly said, As long as you promise me that your first son will be surnamed Yang, I won't stop you. Old man Yang was crazy. He must have gone crazy. Li Yi suspected that it might be because he had gone berserk during his cultivation, or because he had been defeated by him and realized that he was only a pseudo-grandmaster. He suddenly felt that there was no meaning in living and had entered Alzheimer's. He didn't want to argue with a madman, because he still had a lot of things to do. As the saying went, help people to the end, and help the Buddha to the west. He let Yang Liuqing sit on the throne, so he had the responsibility to make sure that she sat on the throne steadily. Now the problem of the national treasury had been solved. A long time ago, Li Yi understood that for the country, the fastest, simplest, and most direct way to make money was of course to confiscate the family, such as the Zhang family. After confiscating a few of them, the national treasury would not be short of money. Of course, it couldn't be like cutting chives, which was not conducive to the stability of the country. The reason why those big families existed was that they had a reason to exist, but what the country needed were obedient families. Removing a few of the biggest tumors with thunderous means would naturally have a deterrent effect on the rest of the people. Next, he would have to take things step by step. In fact, it was to repeat the path that Emingzu had taken. It included setting up an academy, supporting the children of the poor, and breaking the monopoly of the big families in the officialdom. The technology of papermaking and printing would also be passed to her, in order to break the monopoly of the big families on books. The laws of the Wu kingdom also needed to be further improved. Unlike the Jing kingdom, they were still in a stable transition period, so they had to be bold and strict in implementing the laws. In the imperial city these days, a new storm was brewing every day. The spring breeze of reform could no longer be called a spring breeze. The hurricane of reform almost swept across the imperial city with the momentum of sweeping, and then spread to further places. In the eyes of the people of the Wu kingdom, the status of Yang Liuqing was close to that of a god, mainly because the preliminary publicity work was done well. Neither Li Xian nor Zhao Yi could achieve this. So when her orders were carried out, there wouldn't be too many obstacles at all, which was enough to make any emperor blush with shame. Li Yi handed the final version of the strategy of Empress to Yang Liuqing. Next, she only needed to carry it out steadily, and there wouldn't be any big problems. He walked out of the hall, and in front of him, a figure walked over from afar. Bai Su? Li Yi asked with some uncertainty. Greetings, Jiang of Silla. The woman cupped her hands at him casually. Although a girl changed 18 times between childhood and womanhood, Bai Su had long passed 18 years old. Li Yi hadn't seen her for only a few months, but he felt that she had changed a lot. It was very big. Li Yi put those thoughts aside, looked at her, and asked, Do you know where your alliance leader went? I don't know. Bai Su shook her head. Rui didn't tell others about his whereabouts, but it was unlikely that he didn't tell Bai Su. Li Yi thought for a moment, then asked, What are you doing here? Bai Su said casually, To find Lady Qing. Li Yi waved his hand. Their martial arts were similar, and they both followed Rui. Bai Su and Yang Liuqing had a good relationship. In front of a palace, on a large empty space. Bai Su and Yang Liuqing were both panting slightly, their hair a bit messy. Bai Su wiped the sweat from her forehead, and said, it seems that being an empress is really busy. The next time we meet, you won't be a match for me. Yang Liuqing looked at her, curled her lips, and said, you only won by half a move. What is there to be proud of? Half a move is still a win. Bai Su took off her outer garment and put it to the side. She looked at her, and said, next time, it will be 1 or 2 moves. Yang Liuqing didn't continue this topic. She looked at Bai Su, and suddenly said, stand there and don't move. Bai Su looked at her, and asked in confusion, what is it? Yang Liuqing walked in front of her, looked at her for a long time, and suddenly asked, did you find another secret recipe? Bai Su lowered her head, and immediately understood the meaning of her words. She blushed, and asked, you think so too? Yang Liuqing nodded. A smile appeared on Bai Su's face, and she said, when can I be like the alliance leader, dream on. Yang Liuqing looked at her, and then asked, when are you leaving? Bai Su casually said, in 2 days, together with Senior Rui. A hint of envy appeared on Yang Liuqing's face, but it quickly disappeared. The silver needed to build the academy doesn't need to come from the national treasury. The local gentry and rich merchants will be very willing, and even have a lot of surplus. The extra silver needs to be managed by special people, and it will eventually be used on the academy, which can save the national treasury's expenses on the academy. When Li Yi was explaining some details to Yang Liuqing, he found that her eyes were looking forward, and she was lost in thought. Li Yi lightly knocked on the table. Yang Liuqing immediately came back to her senses, and hurriedly said, I'm sorry, Martial Aunt, it's fine. Li Yi waved his hand, and said, if you're tired, we can talk about it tomorrow. I'm not tired. Yang Liuqing shook her head, and looked at him, and said, Martial Aunt, please continue. Li Yi nodded, and spoke again. We can't blindly suppress the large clans in the capital. It's best to rope in some of them, and form a balance and restriction. Li Yi looked at Yang Liuqing, who was in a daze again, and knocked on the table again. She had been very strange these days. She, who had always been more serious than anyone else, had frequently been absent-minded these days. Li Yi looked at her, and asked worriedly, what's wrong with you? Yang Liuqing looked at him, and opened her mouth, but she didn't say anything. There's nothing that can't be said. Li Yi looked at her, and said seriously, no matter what happens, your master and I will stand by your side. Yang Liuqing was silent for a long time, and then she suddenly raised her head, took a deep breath, and looked at Li Yi, and said, Martial Aunt, I don't want to be the emperor anymore. Li Yi was slightly startled. Yang Liuqing looked at him, and gathered her courage, and spoke again, Martial Aunt, I don't want to be the emperor, I want to return to Rui City, I want to return to the Lu League, I want to stay by my master's side, and learn martial arts from her. Chapter 1182. What was wrong with this world? The emperor didn't want to be the emperor, the empress didn't want to be the empress. Li Xian was immersed in the world of science all day long and couldn't extricate himself, and Yang Liuqing didn't want to be the empress, and only wanted to be a small follower behind Rui. Li Yi suddenly felt a little tired. He worked hard for them, day and night, day and night. What was it for? He sighed, looked at Yang Liuqing, and asked, have you thought it through? Yang Liuqing nodded, yes. Li Yi waved his hand and said, if you have thought it through, then go do it. Yang Liuqing looked at him and asked expectantly, Martial Uncle, is this okay? Li Yi sighed again and said, just do what you want to do, and leave the rest to me. Thank you, Martial Uncle. Yang Liuqing's eyes finally lit up again. She took a deep look at Li Yi, and quickly ran out of the hole. Li Yi looked at her decisive back and sighed in his heart. Just what kind of people did he meet? However, who asked him to be her senior master? In this day and age, it was not easy to be a brother, and it was even more difficult to be a senior. The road she took to become an empress was personally paved by him. Now, she wanted to pursue the higher and farther skies outside, leaving behind this mess, and he had to clean up. Young Wanli strode in from outside, looked at Li Yi, and said angrily, "Are you crazy? Is being the emperor like cabbage? If she wants to be, let her be, and if she doesn't want to be, she can't be." Li Yi glanced at him and asked, "Did you ask her if she wanted to be?" Young Wanli's chest heaved a few times, and he suddenly looked at Li Yi and asked, "Who insisted on making her the empress?" Li Yi looked at him and said, "It's the general trend of the world. Once people were shameless, they could be in an invincible position." Young Wanli sat down opposite him and calmed himself down, saying, "She's gone. What about Wu Kingdom?" Li Yi looked at him. "I can't." Young Wanli shook his head. "I know you can't." Li Yi looked at him and said, "However, there will always be a way." There was no such thing as a hopeless situation. The boat would cross the bridge when it came to it. With an unreliable emperor like Li Xian, the Jing kingdom was able to operate normally and steadily. Both major and minor matters were left to the courtiers, and only one person from the royal family was needed to hold the fort. The Jing kingdom might not have Li Xian, but it still had Li Han. Even without Yang Liuqing, the Wu kingdom still had Yang Wanli, right? Yang Wanli noticed that Li Yi was looking at him, and a chill ran down his spine. Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Do you want to defeat Su Tian?" Of course, Yang Wanli wanted to defeat Su Tian. He wanted to get rid of the title of the weakest grandmaster even in his dreams, but he also knew that it was a trap, a huge trap. But he still wanted to defeat Su Tian. He thought for a long time, looked at Li Yi, gritted his teeth, and said, "Yes." Outside the hall, Bai Su covered her breasts with one hand and her buttocks with the other. She said in shock, "Did you hide your strength just now?" Yang Liuqing smiled and said with some pride, "I was just going easy on you last time. If you don't like it, let's fight again." "Let's fight again." Bai Su's face showed a hint of embarrassment. A few days ago, Yi Futian was defeated by her. She didn't believe that in just a few days, Yi Futian had become a different person. She gritted her teeth and went up again. After a quarter of an hour. No more fighting. Bai Su still maintained the posture of covering her breasts with one hand and her buttocks with the other. She looked at Yang Liuqing and asked suspiciously, "Did Senior Rui teach you some tricks again?" Yang Liuqing let out a long sigh of relief, shook his head, and said with a smile, "No." Li Yi felt slightly regretful. Yang Liuqing could learn from anyone, but he just had to learn from a good-for-nothing like Li Xian. Even if she said that she also wanted to become the ruler of the world, Li Yi would immediately have people continuously offer up Tian Fa and cannons, and let Zhao Yi go back to rest and have children. She was already in her 20s, and she was still an emperor. She hadn't even given birth to a son, so what face did she have to wander around? How embarrassing. However, he thought about it, and still didn't plan to force his thoughts on her. If she wanted to learn martial arts from Rui, then so be it. In any case, the identity of the Empress was still there, so there was no difference. He sighed, picked up his brush, and began to list out the rules. In the imperial capital of the Wu Kingdom, in the recent half a month, the Empress who had already ascended the throne for a long time was finally no longer silent. Almost every day, there would be new government decrees being issued. At the beginning, several big families, including the Zhang family, had their properties confiscated in a thunderous way, which caused countless people to clap their hands and cheer. The Ministry of Justice amended dozens of laws, including the abolition of using silver as a substitute for crime, and standardized the process of trial. Every injustice must be redressed, and every case must be tried. For a time, the doorsills of all the government offices were almost broken by people. In addition, the most important thing was the establishment of the National Affairs Council. The National Affairs Council wasn't a department that dissociated from the imperial court. It had 21 members, and all of them were important officials of the imperial court. Among them, Prime Minister Wang was the head, and the 6 ministers were his assistants. The censor, and the 3 military generals all had their own duties. Problems that couldn't be solved by the imperial court would be decided by the votes of the National Affairs Council. If the National Affairs Council didn't agree, and the difference in the number of votes was less than 4, the final decision would be made by the elder ancestor who temporarily took over the government. As for the Empress, she would temporarily leave the imperial capital to inspect the surroundings to stabilize the Wu Kingdom, which had just been stabilized. For the officials of the Wu Kingdom, the National Affairs Council wasn't something new. The neighboring Jing Kingdom did the same thing. Things from the Jing Kingdom were good and worth learning from. There was no doubt about this. The only thing that surprised them was that the Empress would leave the imperial capital. There didn't seem to be such a precedent in the past. However, this wasn't important. It hadn't been a few days since the incident with the Zhang family, so it didn't matter if the Empress left. With the National Affairs Council, the operation of the imperial court wouldn't have any problems. If the Empress stayed in the capital, if one day she had a sudden impulse and decided to purge the various big families, they would have to experience another reign of terror. At the end of the day, they still didn't have much confidence in a woman becoming the Empress. Li Yi discovered that ever since the burden on his shoulders had been removed, Yang Liuqing had come back to life. He watched her spar with Bai Su outside the palace hall, and her figure was unprecedentedly light. From the first time Li Yi saw her, she had been carrying a heavy burden. The great hatred of her parents, the hatred of stealing the country. The hatred of her country and her family pressed down on her until she couldn't breathe. Later, she successfully overthrew the original imperial court and became the Empress herself, but the burden on her shoulders didn't lighten. Instead, it became even heavier. At this moment, she completely let go of all the heavy burdens. Brat, don't lie to me. Can this thing help me defeat Su Tian? Yang Wanli held a small booklet in his hand, and his voice traveled to Li Yi's ear. This was the simplified version of the turtle breathing technique. In order to make him willing to take over the Wu Kingdom's business, Li Yi took out all his trump cards. Li Yi looked at him and asked, "As a grandmaster, you should have the ability to distinguish, right?" Yang Wanli thought for a while, then nodded and said, "Then you have to promise me that you won't pass this technique to Su Tian." Li Yi nodded and said, "Now Su and his concubine are in love, and they spend every day in front of the flowers and under the moon. How would they have time to practice? You just practice according to this book. In less than 5 years, you'll be able to fight him to a draw. In less than 10 years, he won't be a match for you anymore." Yang Wanli thought for a while. This brat had eloped with Qing, this time. In 5 years, the child would already be able to run. After 10 years, with some proper guidance, he would be ready to take over. Although 10 years was a little long, it was still within his acceptable range. He nodded and said, "Okay." Seeing Yang Wanli put away the small booklet and leave, Li Yi let out a long sigh of relief. The matter with the Wu Kingdom had finally come to an end for the time being. There was one thing that he didn't have the heart to tell old Yang. Su had become second granduncle's god-level lackey a long time ago. His skills in cooking were superb, and his progress was naturally even faster. In this life, old Yang might not be a match for him. Deceiving an old man like this made his conscience uneasy. When he went back, he had to remind Su to remember to go easy on him the next time he met him. He turned around, looked at Bai Su, who was not far away, and waved to her. "Now can you tell me, where did your alliance leader go?" "I don't know." The expression on Bai Su's face was a little innocent. Li Yi thought for a while and said, "A secret formula with better effect, and a set of massage techniques. Willow Leaf Village." Chapter 1183. Once again, Li Yi felt that Bai Su was a good comrade. She was bought over by a secret prescription and a set of massage techniques. In the future, if he had any secrets, he must never tell her. Before leaving, he still had to tell Old Man Yang something. Although Yang Liuqing was no longer in the Wu Kingdom, she was still the Empress of the Wu Kingdom. Old Man Yang couldn't just focus on practicing martial arts and ignore the state affairs. He also couldn't be too involved in it. If things got out of hand, he had to talk to him about the limits. Bai Su watched him leave. She rested her hands on her chest and looked at his back. An imperceptible smile appeared on her face. Finally, Li Yi didn't have to worry about the affairs of the Wu Kingdom anymore. After everything here was over, it was already the beginning of July when he and Rui and the others returned to the city of Rui. During this period of time, everything seemed to be very stable. Nothing major happened. Until the second day after they returned to the city of Rui. Mingzu came over with a secret letter and handed it to him. Although Mingzu was no longer in the capital city, many important matters in the court would still be passed to her quickly. Li Yi opened the secret letter and took out a piece of paper. There was only a short line on the paper. On the 3rd of June, the kingdom of Wei surrendered. Li Yi didn't know much about the small countries in the west. He looked at her and asked, "Which country is the kingdom of Wei?" Mingzu sat down beside him and said, "The last country in the west." In other words, Zhao Yi only used a few months to make those small countries in the west perish and surrender. Today, the situation of the three countries of Qi, Jing, and Wu was officially formed. In other words, if Zhao Yi wanted to rule the world, his next target would be either the Wu Kingdom or the Jing Kingdom. It's not that pessimistic. Mingzi shook her head and said, "The reason why the Qi Kingdom was able to sweep through the countries in the west in such a short time was because they relied on the advantage of the heavenly wrath. Now that their heavenly wrath has been depleted, they won't be able to gain the upper hand in a battle against us unless there's a weather problem that renders the heavenly wrath useless. What's more, they destroyed the Zhao Kingdom and those small countries at a rapid pace. They won't be able to settle down in a short period of time. Just the rebellions that need to be suppressed everywhere are enough to give them a headache." Back then, Li Yi had already felt that the Qi Kingdom's swift and reckless act of annihilating the Zhao Kingdom would leave behind serious hidden dangers. This was not Zhao Yi's style. Later on, he didn't care and continued the western expedition, which was even more out of Li Yi's expectations. Although they had destroyed the Zhao Kingdom and those small countries, given the appetite of the Qi Kingdom, they might not be able to swallow so many at once. The biggest possibility was that the areas they conquered would be reduced to the same state as the Wu Kingdom a few years ago, where warlords would divide the territories and heroes would rise. This was a situation that gave Li Yi a headache just by thinking about it. Until now, he still couldn't figure out what Zhao Yi was so anxious about. No matter what Zhao Yi was anxious about, the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom were anxious. Yang Liuqing had just arrived when the Wu Kingdom sent an urgent memorial to him. The State Council had already sent envoys to form an alliance with the Jing Kingdom to resist the Qi Kingdom. At the same time, the decision of the Jing Kingdom's imperial court was also sent to Mingzu. They expressed the same thoughts as the Wu Kingdom. The Qi Kingdom was indeed powerful, but if Zhao Yi wasn't lucky enough to develop divine punishment, the gap between hot weapons and cold weapons would be insurmountable. Moreover, he couldn't even take care of himself now, let alone deal with the alliance between the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom. Of course, nothing was absolute. No matter what, the alliance between the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom was necessary. These matters were the concerns of Li Xian, Old Man Yang, and the officials of the Jing Kingdom and the Wu Kingdom. Li Yi planned to stay in Rui City for a few days to accompany Ruoqing and Zumo before leaving for Qing and Prefecture. This time, he couldn't let Rui escape again. The temperature in the mountains was just right. Even at noon, it didn't seem too hot. Li Yi moved the rocking chair under a tree. A gentle breeze blew, and the shadows of the trees swayed, making a rustling sound. This was a more suitable place to take a nap than the bed in the room. He had a dream that he had often had these days. The figure of Mississippi Lu riding on a horse always appeared in his dream. She was still so condescending, looking at him with indifferent eyes, just like when they first met. Today's dream was different. He looked at Mississippi Lu on the horse, and as he looked, she disappeared, replaced by Li Xian's appearance. This was a horrible nightmare. Li Yi opened his eyes in shock and saw Li Xian standing beside him, looking at him. Li Yi let out a sigh of relief. It was just a dream, and he hadn't woken up from it yet. Li Xian played with two black objects in his hands and said, "I found two magnets. Why do they attract each other, and then repel each other?" Li Yi patted his face and then pinched it. It hurt. He almost jumped out of the rocking chair. He looked at him and said in shock, "Why are you here?" Li Xian glanced at him and asked, "Why can't I be here?" The Qi kingdom has already destroyed the Zhao kingdom and the countries in the west. Their next target might be the Jing kingdom. What are you doing here instead of staying in the capital? It's because of this that I'm here. Li Xian thought about it and said, "This place is closer to the Qi kingdom, and also closer to the Wu kingdom. Orders can reach the front lines in the shortest time possible, so I'm here." Li Yi had always felt that he was quite shameless, but compared to Li Xian, he was still far from it. Zhao Yi had destroyed the last country in the west more than a month ago. Now that Li Xian had appeared in front of him, it meant that he had set off at least 2 months ago. Could it be that he could foresee the future? Based on this, he had actually set off in a hurry 3 months after he and Emingzu had left the capital. Li Yi looked at him and asked with a frown, "You left the crown prince in the capital when he's not even a year old yet?" Li Xian looked behind him, and Li Yi looked over. Wang Qin was holding a baby and talking to Rui, and Shen Su was standing beside her. He thought about it. Li Xian had dragged his family and brought a child over, so the journey must have been even slower. In other words, he didn't even wait until he and Emingzu had left the capital for 3 months. Perhaps it was 2 months, or even earlier. "I can't bear to part with Zhe, Li Xian sighed and said, "He's still so young, he won't be happy being the emperor." The Li family had finally recovered a little of their humanity, and this was something to be happy about. "Why haven't you and Emingzu married yet?" Li Xian frowned at him and said, "Hurry up and have a son. You already have 2 sons, give birth to another one to be the emperor." In any case, Emingzu also has the blood of the imperial family, and the child she gives birth to will also have the surname Li. Li Yi took back his earlier thoughts. It had only been a few months, but Li Xian had completely lost his humanity. Shaoning held Yongning's hand and ran over happily. She asked, "Brother, now that you and sister-in-law have come, are you going back?" Li Xian smiled and said, "I'm not going back." Li Yi finally found the reason for his uneasiness these past few days. Trouble had come, and once it had come, it wouldn't leave. When Li Xian moved his family to Rui City, the happiest person was Li Duan. He couldn't wait to take Xiao Rui to the largest amusement park in the prince's mansion. "To be honest, what I said just now, you should consider it." Li Xian looked at him and said, "Zhe is my first son. I plan to pass on all my knowledge to him so that he can continue my research in the future. This way, he can't be the emperor. I originally wanted Emingzi to be the emperor, but if your son becomes the emperor, it will be the same," Li Yi said resolutely and decisively. "I won't consider it." Li Xian turned his head and looked at Yang Liuqing, who was not far away. He asked, "Why is your martial niece empress here?" A look of surprise suddenly appeared on his face. He immediately said, "Could it be that she has the same idea?" Li Yi lay back on the rocking chair. He had nothing left to live for. Each and every one of them thought that his Rui city was some kind of place. Those who didn't know better would think that he was not only a grandmaster but also an emperor. Fong walked in from outside. He looked at Li Yi with an indescribable expression. He finally came back to his senses and said, "Young master, someone is looking for you." "Who?" Li Yi asked casually. "Xiao Yi." Chapter 1184. Li Yi didn't know which Xiao Yi Fong was referring to, which Xiao Yi was. If it was the Xiao Yi he knew, the Qi kingdom would have ended its western expedition just over a month ago. Unless Xiao Yi had wings, it would be impossible for him to appear here. If it wasn't the Xiao Yi, he wouldn't have known any other Xiao Yi. Li Yi suppressed his doubts and said, "Let him in." Soon, Li Yi knew which Xiao Yi the Xiao Yi was. He looked at Li Xian, then looked at Yang Liuqing, who was walking over, and then looked at Xiao Yi, who was walking in from outside the door. The world must have gone mad. Either that, or he hadn't woken up from his afternoon nap and was still dreaming. He pinched Li Xian's arm and asked, "Does it hurt?" It could be seen from the pained expression on Li Xian's face that he was in great pain. Xiao Yi walked in from outside the door and walked to Li Yi's side. He cupped his hands and smiled, saying, "Brotherly, we meet again." Then, he turned to look at Li Xian with a slightly surprised look in his eyes. "Emperor Jing is here too." His eyes finally fell on Yang Liuqing. He looked at him for a long time before asking, "Is this the Empress of the Wu Kingdom?" Li Yi felt that it was a pity that there was no camera at this time. The 10th day of the 7th month in the 5th year of Jingping was an extraordinary day. The emperors of Qi, Jing, and Wu kingdoms, the three most powerful people in the world, had gathered together without any warning. Together with him, they could form a table of mahjong. This was a day that would go down in the annals of history. This was also a table of mahjong that would shock the ancients and dazzle the contemporaries. Xiao Yi looked at Li Yi again and said with a smile, "I've come from afar, but Brother Li can't even bear to give me a cup of tea." Li Yi looked at the three of them, then turned to Fong and said, "Serve the tea." After drinking a cup of tea and calming himself down, Li Yi still felt that the world had gone crazy. Xiao Yi's wish to become the ruler of the world had been fulfilled by 1/3. In terms of territory, the area conquered by the Qi kingdom was larger than that of the Jing kingdom and the Wu kingdom combined. That was to say, he had already achieved more than 50% of his dream. If he wanted to be the only emperor, sooner or later, he would have to go against the Jing kingdom and the Wu kingdom. But now, he was sitting here drinking tea with the emperor of the Jing kingdom and the empress of the Wu kingdom. All Li Yi had to do was add some seasoning to his tea or wave his hand, and he, the future emperor, would be done for. Xiao Yi looked at Li Xian and asked, "Emperor Jing isn't in the capital. Why is he here? Why do you care?" Li Xian glanced at him and said, "If you can be here, why can't I be here?" Li Yi could tell that Li Xian was very hostile towards Xiao Yi. This was normal. The relationship between the Qi kingdom and the Jing kingdom had always been tense. It was unthinkable that the two emperors could sit here and drink tea. If there was no hostility, could they still call each other brothers? "I haven't seen Emperor Jing for a few years, but he has become more and more irritable." Xiao Yi looked at him and didn't care. He just smiled and said, "A few years ago, when we first met in the Jade's courtyard in the capital, where did the elegant crown prince Li Xian go?" "Are you insulting me?" Li Xian suddenly stood up and looked at him angrily. "Are you looking for a fight?" Li Yi pressed Li Xian's shoulder down. It wasn't that he thought he was ruining the atmosphere, but that he didn't want him to humiliate himself. Xiao Yi was a true master of both the pen and the sword. He could govern a country and fight a war. His martial arts were also top-notch. Li Xian's mediocre martial arts couldn't compare to him. He looked at Xiao Yi and asked, "You didn't come all the way here just to ask for a cup of tea from me, did you?" "Of course not." Xiao Yi smiled and said, "It's been a difficult journey. If I don't get to taste Brother Li's cooking, wouldn't it be a wasted trip?" He didn't expect him to not only come for tea, but also for food. Li Yi looked at him and said, "The price of my cooking is very high. I wonder if you can afford it." Xiao Yi only smiled and said, "To be able to taste Brother Li's cooking, I'm giving the world to you. What's wrong with that? After all, you were the one who gave me this world back then." "Wait." Li Xian looked suspicious and said, "What world? What gift? Why didn't I know about this?" Li Xian didn't know because Li Yi didn't tell him in detail. He gave the Qi kingdom to Xiao Yi, and then Xiao Yi led the Qi kingdom to destroy the Zhao kingdom and the western countries, and then pointed the spearhead at the Jing kingdom and the Wu kingdom. Wasn't this slapping his own face? That's not important. Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Let's cook. I still owe you a meal, and I'll pay it back." Xiao Yi had owed this meal for several years, and he had never formally paid it back. It didn't seem right to delay it any longer. Xiao Yi sighed and said, "Brother Li, Xiao Yi has waited 8 years for this meal." Li Xian frowned and said, "Don't try to change the topic. What do you mean by giving the world? What is it?" Xiao Yi looked at Li Xian, then looked at Yang Liuqing, and said, "Can the two of you leave for a moment? I have something to say to Brother Li alone." Yang Liuqing looked at Li Yi, and Li Yi nodded slightly. She then stood up and left. Li Xian frowned and said, "What can't be said directly? You two still haven't told me what the world is all about." Li Yi looked at Li Xian, and Li Xian looked back at him. After a while, they left with an ugly expression. Xiao Yi looked at Li Yi again and said, "I'm afraid I won't be able to wait until the day I become the ruler of the world." Li Xian poked his head back and said disdainfully, "Tisk, you're talking like you're the ruler of the world. Why don't you try fighting? I'll give you 10 Tian Fa pills." After Li Xian had left, Xiao Yi sighed and said, "I'm not as good as Li Xian." Li Yi shook his head and said, "You're better than him in every other way except not being as stupid as him." Xiao Yi didn't agree with him and said, "Sometimes, it's better to be a bit stupid." What he said made a lot of sense. As the saying went, fortune favors fools, but fools don't. Fortunately, Li Xian belonged to the former. Xiao Yi looked at him and suddenly asked, "If Brother Li had been born in the Qi kingdom, and if I had known you before Li Xian, would the result have been different?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "There are no ifs." Xiao Yi covered his mouth and began to cough. He took out a handkerchief from his sleeve and covered his mouth and nose. Li Yi was just wondering how he had become so effeminate after not seeing him for just over a year. Just as this thought arose in his mind, he saw bright red seeping out of the handkerchief. His face showed shock. "You?" Xiao Yi smiled and said, "I just said, I can't wait until the day I become the ruler of the world." It was only now that Li Yi understood what he meant. Li Yi suddenly couldn't help but feel sad. He opened his mouth and only spoke after a long time, "What illness?" There were many reasons for coughing up blood, including bronchial diseases, lung diseases, esophageal diseases, endometriosis, and so on. Not every illness was fatal. Xiao Yi shook his head and said, "This is not important." Li Yi was silent for a long time and then asked, "How much longer?" Xiao Yi smiled and said, "After conquering the Zhao kingdom, I went back to recuperate for a few days. The imperial doctor said that I have at most half a year." Li Yi was silent again. Xiao Yi suddenly raised his head and looked at him, asking, "Do you know why I want to become the ruler of the world?" "I always thought it was your ambition." Xiao Yi shook his head and said, "Because I had a promise with someone. She didn't like war. She often told me that if the Qi kingdom, the Jing kingdom, and the Wu kingdom all became one country, how good it would be. There would be no more wars between countries, and there wouldn't be so many families being separated, and the old sending off the young. Isn't it good for everyone to be happy? She died. Before she died, I said that I would help her fulfill her wish. She was called Xiao Ji, and she was my younger sister. Now I am also going to die. Xiao Yi looked at Li Yi and said seriously, Brother Li, you once gave me the Qi kingdom. Now, I am returning it to you. Chapter 1185. You once gave me the Qi kingdom. Now, I'm returning it to you. Xiao Yi looked at Li Yi and said very seriously. I don't want it. Li Yi replied firmly without thinking. He wanted to give a country, not a piece of jade, a painting or some other gift. How could a lunatic give a country to someone else? This was not a melodramatic novel. How could he give such a big country as he wanted? Li Yi reminded him, that's your Qi kingdom. Xiao Yi corrected him, it's yours. Li Yi suddenly asked, do you have a son? No. Xiao Yi shook his head and said. Li Yi thought for a while and said, a daughter is fine too, I don't have a daughter either. He was so old, but he didn't have a son or a daughter. Li Xian had 4 children, and he had 3. Xiao Yi was about the same age as them, but he didn't even have a son. Wasn't he ashamed? Li Yi still didn't give up and asked, do you have any other younger sisters or elder sisters? They can't be the ruler of the world. Xiao Yi looked at him and said, only you can. Have you ever considered my feelings? Li Yi looked at him and said seriously, I don't want to, I know you don't want to. Confucius once said, don't do to others what you don't want to be done to yourself. Li Yi thought, don't do to others what you don't want to be done to yourself. Xiao Yi wanted to be the ruler of the world, but he didn't want to. He insisted on being the ruler himself, which was his fault. Around him, there were only 3 countries left, the Qi kingdom, the Jing kingdom, and the Wu kingdom. The emperor of the Jing kingdom wanted his unborn son. The queen of the Wu kingdom abandoned her country and came to learn martial arts from his fiancé. The emperor of the Qi kingdom was even more powerful. He wanted him. Li Yi suddenly felt that the whole world was full of malice against him. He looked at Xiao Yi and asked, do you think the people of the Qi kingdom and the officials of the Qi kingdom will agree with you? Xiao Yi smiled and said, I still have half a year. Half a year is enough for me to clear all the obstacles for you. What else could Li Yi say? He grabbed Xiao Yi's wrist and said with a sullen face, come with me. Xiao Yi subconsciously tried to shake off his hand, but failed. She could only let Li Yi drag her out of the courtyard. Li Xian pressed his ear against the door. When Li Yi pulled the door open, he almost dashed in. Li Yi walked in front of Li Yi with a dark face. Of Yi. With the world. Li Yi Li world. He just wanted to know if Xiao Yi could be saved or not. Elder Tian and Su had returned from their travels a few days ago. Elder Tian was not only skilled in martial arts but was also skilled in medicine. Li Yi planned to let her take a look at Xiao Yi. In front of a grass hut. Xiao Yi looked at Li Yi and shook his head. I've already seen through life and death. Brother Li, there's no need to waste your time. Li Yi frowned. Cut the crap. Do you want to go in yourself or do you want me to bring you in? I'll go in myself. Xiao Yi nodded helplessly. He looked at him and said, I'll have to trouble Brother Li to wait outside for a moment. It's not like I have a venereal disease. There's no need to hide from people. Li Yi thought, but he still didn't step inside. Give me your wrist. In the grass hut, Elder Tian sat in front of a table and looked at him. Xiao Yi didn't extend his wrist. He shook his head and said, I don't dare to trouble Elder. They've found many miracle doctors these days. I don't want to hear the same thing again. Elder Tian raised his eyebrows. Then why do you still want to come in? Zhao Yi explained, brotherly won't give up if I don't come in. Since you're here, you might as well take a look. Elder Tian stood up. When he spoke, he had already disappeared from his original spot. 3 fingers were pinching his wrist. By the time Zhao Yi reacted, she had already let go of his wrist. She looked at Zhao Yi for a long time. Zhao Yi met her gaze. After a long time, Elder Tian shook his head and sighed. It's indeed a terminal illness. There's no medicine that can cure it, a terminal illness. There's no medicine that can cure it. This was the answer Li Yi got from Elder Tian. There were medical books in his library, but he lacked medical equipment and herbs. Apart from theories, he had nothing else. He shook his head and walked back to the hut. It wasn't easy for the 3 sovereigns to gather together. Naturally, it wasn't a big deal for him to cook. After knowing that Zhao Yi didn't have long to live, Li Xian's attitude toward him improved. At the very least, he didn't keep a straight face at all times. He squatted in the courtyard and observed the steam pushing the lid of the pot up. In the end, he even started to talk about atmospheric pressure with Zhao Yi with great interest. After the meal, Li Yi and Zhao Yi took a stroll on the streets. It's a pity that I'm able to eat Brother Li's cooking before I die. Li Yi was unmoved by Zhao Yi's compliments. He knew that Zhao Yi's cooking was delicious. It was delicious even without his compliments. This is a great place. Zhao Yi looked around and said, when she was still alive, she often dreamed of a world where no one picked up anything on the road and no one closed their doors at night. No one picked up anything on the road and no one closed their doors at night. Even if they waited for another 1,000 years, they wouldn't be able to realize it. Li Yi knew that Zhao Yi was talking about his younger sister, Zhao Ji. In order to respect the deceased, Li Yi didn't say this out loud. He changed the topic and asked, she was your younger sister? Zhao Yi nodded and said, we were born of the same mother. Zhao Yi, Zhao Ji. Li Yi shook his head and said, your names are quite similar. Some people might write them wrong if they're not careful. It was my mother who named us. Even my younger sister and I often made mistakes when we were young, let alone ordinary people. Zhao Yi smiled and said, at first, my mother was just a palace maid in the palace. It was only after my father got drunk that I was born and she was given the title of concubine. She had never been educated, but she begged my father to give us names. For this reason, she flipped through many books and felt that these 2 words were the most beautiful. Li Yi didn't think these 2 words were very beautiful. He felt that the Zhao kingdom and the 20-odd small kingdoms to the west were wronged. The destruction of their kingdom was actually because of the unrealistic dreams of a deceased girl. Forget it. Thinking about how the previous emperor of the Wu kingdom had died, he felt that he didn't have the right to criticize Zhao Yi on this matter. The Qi kingdom can't fall into the hands of others. Zhao Yi looked at him and suddenly said, only you can do what I want to do. He took out a golden plate again and handed it to Li Yi. He said, after I die, you can take this plate and command the Qi kingdom. I live well in Rui City. Why should I command the Qi kingdom? I don't want it. Whoever wants it can have it. Li Yi shook his head and strode forward. He stopped a figure in front of him and said, Bai Su, wait a minute. He confirmed again from Bai Su that Rui was still in Willow Leaf Village. Li Yi couldn't wait to leave here to find her. First, because he missed her. Second, he didn't want to deal with the series of things here anymore. The so-called world leader had nothing to do with him. He didn't want this broken plate at all. Zhao Yi walked back to the yard and put the plate on the stone table in the yard. He turned his head and looked at the 2 people who had been following him. He said, we'll leave tomorrow. The guard looked embarrassed. He said, Your Majesty, you should rest for a while. Zhao Yi sighed and said, there's no time. When he walked out of the yard, he couldn't help coughing loudly. He took out a handkerchief and covered his mouth and nose. "What's wrong?" An old man with a walking stick walked out from another courtyard. When he saw the traces of blood on the handkerchief, a look of surprise appeared on his old face. "Why did he spit blood?" he murmured. He looked down and handed over a chicken leg in his hand. He said, "Would you like a chicken leg to calm down?" Lee packed his luggage and looked at Bai Su. He asked, "Are you sure she's still in Willow Leaf Village?" "Yes." Bai Su nodded and said. Lee nodded and waved his hand. He said, "Let's go." "Goodbye, Jiang of Silla." Bai Su waved to him and walked to a woman not far away. He said in a low voice, "Tell the leader that the fish has taken the bait." Chapter 1186. Qing and Prefecture was the second largest city in the Jing Kingdom, second only to the capital. In the past few years, it had become increasingly prosperous. Of course, the title of the second largest city was no longer true. Today, Qing and Prefecture was inferior to the capital of Suzhou in terms of population and economy. However, it still had a high status in the hearts of the people of the Jing Kingdom. The small Anxi County government was even treated as a paradise by many officials. There had once been a constable who became the Minister of Justice. There had once been a county magistrate who was promoted to the capital magistrate. There had once been a constable who was an assistant princess. There had once been a county lieutenant who was conferred the title of one-word king. The local official positions in Qing and Prefecture had been tacitly accepted by the imperial court as some sort of springboard. Any official who had enough experience here would eventually rise to the top and be transferred to the capital. Today was Anxi County Magistrate Jiang Xian's big day. Of course, this was not the joy of a wedding, but the joy of a promotion. Due to his outstanding performance in the past few years, Anxi County Magistrate Jiang Xian had been appointed as the capital magistrate and would be transferred to the capital in a few days. Congratulations, Lord Jiang. Congratulations, Lord Jiang, on your promotion. Lord Jiang, you will definitely rise to the top. One day, I hope Lord Jiang will guide you. I'm ashamed. My colleagues, please take a seat. In a restaurant in Anxi County, Jiang Xian was holding a banquet with guests, his face full of smiles. At the entrance of the restaurant, a man carrying a cloth bag looked at the young man beside him and asked, "Young master, do you want to go in and say hello?" Li smiled and shook his head, "No need, let's go." Today was Jiang Xian's big day. If he went in to say hello, he would not be surprised, but frightened. In the restaurant, Jiang Xian was socializing with a few officials. His eyes inadvertently swept across the entrance of the restaurant and suddenly froze. Then he put down his wine cup and quickly ran over. He ran out of the restaurant and stood on the street. He looked around blankly, but could only see a bustling crowd. Someone hurried out of the restaurant and asked with concern, "Lord Jiang, what's wrong?" Jiang Xian stood on the street for a long time before shaking his head and saying, "It's nothing, go in." When he walked into the restaurant, there was still a look of confusion on his face. He had clearly seen His Highness Jiang of Silla, but when he chased after him, there was nothing there. It should be a misconception. He laughed and turned his head to the crowd. "My fellow comrades, I'll drink first as a sign of respect." Rui Square. Rui Workshop was the most famous perfume shop in Qing and Prefecture. The perfume it produced was long-lasting and pleasing. It was very popular with women. Standing at the entrance of Rui Workshop, Fong looked at Li Yi and smiled. "Young master, second mistress was right. Rui Workshop sounds much better than the Six Spirits Workshop. If you insisted on calling it Six Spirits Workshop, your business wouldn't be as good as it is now." Li Yi didn't know if the shop's business would be so good if he had insisted on calling it Six Gods Workshop. However, he was sure that he wouldn't be doing so well. After all, he couldn't afford to offend Rui back then. Of course, he still couldn't afford to offend the current Rui. Li Yi walked into Rui's workshop. Immediately, a young girl came forward and asked with a smile, "Young master, what would you like to see?" "Just looking around." Li Yi smiled and walked toward the back of the house. There was a small yard behind the shop. For a long time, Li Yi would lie under the pear tree in the yard. There would often be a head lying on the wall, listening to him tell ghost stories. At that time, little Pearl didn't have the skills to make wine like she did now. A story about the painted skin could scare her so much that she fell off the wall. At that time, Ruoqing and Zuemo lived just a wall away. That was probably a rare period of time in his life that was so comfortable that it was ridiculous. As Li Yi was thinking about this, the young girl's voice gradually became clear in his ears. Young master, you can't come in here." Seeing that the young master walked straight into the back of the house and was blocked by the big man, the young girl hurriedly ran back and said anxiously, "Shopkeeper, come out quickly." Soon, an old man hurriedly ran over with a slightly angry expression. "You guys." He only said 2 words before he stood still and knelt on the ground, trembling, and said loudly, "Greetings, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." The young girl was startled, her face turned pale. Her knees weakened and she was about to kneel down, but Li Yi held her in time. He also helped the old man up and said with a smile, "No need to be so polite." The young girl looked at him and said with a trembling voice, "Jing, Your Highness Jiang of Silla, don't be afraid, I'm not a tiger." Li Yi looked at her and said with a smile, "You've done well." He turned to look at the old man and said with a smile, "Give this young lady 10 times more money this month." "Yes." The old man responded in a daze. Li Yi and Fong had already walked out. When the 2 of them came back to their senses, they hurriedly ran over, but the figure from before had already disappeared. The young girl's face showed a look of reverence, and she asked, "Shopkeeper, is that His Highness Jiang of Silla?" "He's so young." The old man's face showed a look of reminiscence, and he said, "Even though I've only seen His Highness once, I'll never forget him in this lifetime." The young girl thought for a moment and said tentatively, "Then what His Highness just said, 10 times more money." The old man knocked on her head and said, "Since His Highness has already said so, you naturally won't be left out." Outside of Qing and Prefecture, in the Li family village, Li Yi stopped in front of a lonely grave for a long time, and he cleaned up the few weeds on the grave. This was the grave of his father, whom he had never met. The Jing kingdom had a custom of not moving graves easily. These years, he hadn't done any major renovations, and he only told the old village head to keep people away from this place. Fong stood in front of a dilapidated house, and said, "Young master, this is where you used to live." "It's not much better than where we live." Li Yi didn't have much affection for this house in the Li family village. But this was the beginning of his life, and its significance was naturally extraordinary. Since he was passing by this time, he decided to take a look. "You two, what are you doing?" A hoarse voice suddenly came from behind the 2 of them. Li Yi turned his head and saw an old man with white hair and a stooped body slowly walking towards them. A smile appeared on his face, and he said, "Old village head, long time no see." "What did you say?" The old man squinted his eyes, got closer to him, and said loudly, "Louder, I can't hear you." Obviously, the old village head didn't recognize him, and he didn't hear what he said. Li Yi got closer, and said in a slightly louder voice, "Old village head, don't you recognize me?" "What? You're here to steal things." The old village head knocked his walking stick on the ground, and said angrily, "How dare you say that you're stealing things?" He turned around, and shouted to the distance, "Dezhuang, Erzwang, you 2 come here quickly. Catch these 2 thieves and send them to the government." Li Yi raised his head, and saw 2 strong men trotting towards him. He was startled, and then a smile appeared on his face. He patted Fong's shoulder, and asked, "Why aren't you running? Are you waiting to be caught?" Old Fong stood rooted to the ground as he watched Li Yi dash off into the distance. He scratched his head in bewilderment as he followed Li Yi in a mad dash. The old man stood there in a daze, and he murmured, "These two thieves run really fast." Li Yi ran very fast, and he ran very far. He relied entirely on his physical strength, and when he couldn't run anymore, he bent over and panted heavily. Fong almost couldn't keep up with him. He was slightly out of breath, and he asked, young master, why are you running so fast?" Rumble. As soon as he finished his words, the ground under his feet suddenly shook. A cloud of smoke rolled over from the end of their sight, and stopped a few steps in front of them. At the forefront, on a tall horse, a woman in white clothes looked down at them. She looked around, and then looked at Li Yi. She waved her hand, and said lightly, "Tie him up." Chapter 1187. In a room in Willow Leaf Village, Li Yi was wearing a red wedding robe and was tied up in a very humiliating way. It was a familiar scene. This was the second time in his life that he had been kidnapped by Rui. If Fong hadn't betrayed him at the critical moment and sealed his acupuncture point from behind, Li Yi felt that he could still resist symbolically. The door of the room was pushed open, and Mississippi Lu walked in from the outside. The situation was stronger than him, so he had to lower his head when he should. "Now that things have come to this, it's up to you whether you want to kill me or not." Li Yi raised his head and said without fear, "Even if you want to rape me, I won't resist." "Okay." Mississippi Lu nodded and said. Then, he was really defiled. Tonight in Willow Leaf Village, big red lanterns were hung high, and everywhere was full of joy. It seemed that even the moonlight was covered with a light layer of red. Fong was drinking with others outside and said proudly, "Let me tell you, when the son-in-law came to the mountain for the first time, he was kidnapped by me." Beside him, many members of the Lu League looked envious. "Brother Fong, please tell us more details." Yes, at that time, was it also the leader who did it? "Come on, fill up Brother Fong's cup first." Fong took a sip of wine with satisfaction, and his eyes were full of reminiscence. He murmured, "Tell us more details, then tell us more details." 3 months later, in Rui City. Li Yi was lying on the grass, and Li Mu was barefooted, running around in front of him with 2 little girls. She was a little older than Li Xian's second and third girls, and she liked the feeling of being an elder sister very much. Further away, Rui and Wang Qin were talking about something, and Li Duan and Li Rui were standing behind them hand in hand. No one knew what they heard, but they both blushed and ran away quickly with their heads down. They ran to Drunk Mo's side, held hands, and watched Drunk Mo paint Ruoqing and Wanru. Xiao Zhu made a new cocktail. Xiao Huan and Xiao Chui didn't want to be her wine tasters, so she chased after them. Shanning held Yong Ning's hand and stood together with Yang Liuqing and Bai Su, looking at a certain place from afar. As far as they could see, 2 figures danced in the air, so fast that they could only see faint shadows. Rui forced herself on Willow Village, so she was 1 step earlier than Emingsu. But in the grand wedding a month ago, she wore the wedding dress again. There was no need to compare Emingsu and Shanning. However, between Rui and Emingsu, they always preferred to solve the problem of who was the older sister and who was the younger sister by force. This problem had not been solved yet. Therefore, they had to fight every day. Chen Chong and third Miss Chen were talking in the pavilion. Tsing Shichen walked to Li Yi's side and said, "This time, we have almost reached an agreement with the Wu Kingdom. If the Qi Kingdom makes another move, the Jing Kingdom and the Wu Kingdom will send troops at the same time." This time, Tsing Shichen came as an envoy from the Jing Kingdom to negotiate with the Wu Kingdom. Li Yi didn't know why the 2 countries chose to negotiate in his Rui City. Xiao Yi left the second day after he left Rui City for Qing and Prefecture. After that, there was no news of him. Li Yi asked someone to check. He did have a sister called Zhao Ji, but she had passed away 10 years ago. Because Emingzu, Yang Liuqing, and Li Xian were all here, all the news that the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom had found were naturally gathered here. During this time, personnel changes in the imperial court of the Qi Kingdom were extremely frequent, so frequent that it was frightening. No matter what period of time a country was in, officials would not be promoted or demoted so frequently. This move of Emperor Qi made the entire imperial court anxious. The state of Zhao and the western states that had been destroyed by the state of Qi also started to show signs of instability. In the past few months, there had already been dozens of major riots. As for the smaller ones, there were even more that could not be counted. The Qi Kingdom had the ability to destroy so many countries, but it didn't have the ability to stabilize and govern. This was also the reason why Li Yi didn't understand Zhao Yi's move at the beginning. He didn't know whether what Zhao Yi said was true or not, but the current situation of the Qi Kingdom was not optimistic. The drawbacks of the Western expedition had been exposed. They didn't have the ability to send troops to the Jing Kingdom and the Wu Kingdom anymore. They needed a lot of energy to deal with those riots and rebels. Fong walked over and handed him a letter, saying, "Young master, a letter from the Qi Kingdom." Li Yi took the letter. The envelope was light, but he felt it was heavy. After a long while, he opened the envelope and read it for a long time. He walked back into the room and took out a golden plate. Why did he have to clean up the mess left by everyone? He had an urge to curse. He opened his mouth, but he just sighed. Rui and Emingzu had a new competition. Rui chose the Zhao Kingdom, and Emingzu chose the Western countries. The winner would be the one who pacified the rebellion in the selected region and stabilized the situation. Rui had Yang Liuqing, Bai Su, and the experts of Lu Mang. Of course, she could also mobilize the 100,000 troops, the 100,000 troops of the Qi Kingdom. Although Emingzu only had herself, she was well versed in the art of war. In this aspect, Rui and Yang Liuqing couldn't compare. In a situation where the number of troops was equal, Li Yi didn't know who would be the final winner. This question was not important to Li Yi. What was important was that Yang Wanli and Su came out of the forest over there, and their faces were extremely dark. Li Yi looked at Xing Shichen and said, "I have something to do. I'll leave first." "Brat, don't run." Yang Wanli's angry voice came from behind. Li Yi turned around and shouted, "Don't blame me if you can't beat them. Bastard, I won't believe you anymore." Old Yang's angry voice came from behind, "I don't care about your stupid Wu Kingdom anymore. You can have your own sons and take care of it." Li Yi felt helpless. He was not the one who taught Elder Su his martial arts. Second great uncle was so happy with the chicken dinner that even a little bit of it was enough to benefit him. Old Yang was unlucky, so he could not be blamed. Although Old Yang was no match for him now, he was in the wrong, so he had to hide from him. Besides him, he also hid from little Zhu, little Cui, and even Bai Su for several days, because their eyes were too resentful. Emingzu and Rui couldn't compete to see who could pacify the chaos first. Because they were both pregnant. Maybe they could compete to see who could give birth first. If Rui hadn't been pregnant a month ago, Li Yi wouldn't have been able to handle it even if he had become a guru. Li Yi guessed in his heart. Could it be that it was easier for grandmasters to have children? Li Xian walked over with a smile and said, "If Emingzu gives birth to a son, I will pass the throne to him. Get lost." Li Yi said bluntly. Li Xian wasn't angry at all. He picked up his little son and swayed him, saying, Let's go. Daddy will take you to play on the steamboat. We don't want to be emperors." The rebellion of the Qi Kingdom was a big problem for the imperial court of the Qi Kingdom to solve, but it wasn't the same for the Jing Kingdom and the Wu Kingdom. Within a year, the rebellion of the Zhao Kingdom and the Western countries had been put down. At this point, there were only 3 countries left on this continent. The Qi Kingdom, the Jing Kingdom, and the Wu Kingdom weren't united. They just moved their capitals in the same year. Song Prefecture of the Wu Kingdom, Shu Prefecture of the Jing Kingdom, and Feng Prefecture of the Qi Kingdom became the new capitals. These three places had one thing in common. They were very close to Rui City because their rulers lived there. The Qi Kingdom didn't have an emperor. The state council was in charge. When something big couldn't be decided, Emingzu would help. Li Xian had completely become the emperor. He had trained Li Zhe to be a qualified scientist since he was young. It wasn't just a year or two since he had set his eyes on her and Mingzhu's son. Before this, it was Emingzu who made the decisions. Wu Kingdom. Before Li Yi left this time, the old man warned him again that if they still couldn't have a son, he wouldn't care anymore. It was another Qingming festival. Rui City was very close to Feng Prefecture. Every year at this time, Li Yi would accompany Wanru back to Feng Prefecture to visit the grave. As expected, it rained during the Qingming festival. The road was muddy. Wanru was pregnant. Li Yi asked her to light a few sticks of incense in the ancestral hall of the Lin family. He went to the cemetery in the suburbs alone. There were many people paying respects to their ancestors during the Qingming festival. Li Yi cleaned the few weeds on the grave and was ready to leave after paying his respects. He didn't go back directly. Feng Prefecture used to be Zhao Yi's fief. There was a cenotaph for his cenotaph here. There were many people paying respects in front of the cenotaph. Li Yi didn't go near it. He stood in the distance and watched. Zhao Yi's wish to be the ruler of the world had come true. However, he would never see it again. The gloomy weather suddenly started to rain. The rain was getting heavier. In front of the cenotaph, people began to leave in a hurry. When Li Yi went out, he didn't bring an umbrella. People kept walking past him. He stood there and looked at the cenotaph until there was no one around. At a certain moment, the rain suddenly became lighter. It wasn't that the rain became lighter. Instead, a paper umbrella appeared above his head. The woman holding the umbrella looked at him and asked, "It's raining. Why don't you go?" Li Yi looked at the woman, and the woman looked at him calmly. Li Yi looked at her for a long time. He suddenly said, "You look like a friend of mine." "Is that so?" The woman smiled and asked, "What's her name?" "Xiao Yi." "That's a coincidence, you're also called Xiao Yi." The woman looked at him and smiled. "My name is Xiao Ji." The end of the book. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.